A blizzard swallowed the state of Wyoming before midnight. Roads turned to ice, power went dead across 3 counties, and inside a roadside diner outside Laramie, a little girl no older than 8 sat in the last booth by the frozen window, signing 2 words beneath the table where nobody could see. Not my mom. Nobody heard her. Nobody saw. Except one man, a scarred biker with frost in his beard and blood on his conscience, who had no business being alive on a night like this. What happened next in that diner didn't just save one child. It cracked open a trafficking operation that had been swallowing kids across the Mountain West for years. Stay with me to the very end of this one. If this story hits you, drop a like, leave a comment, tell me what city you're watching from. And whatever you do, don't stop listening, because this one's going to stay with you long after it's over. The storm didn't come with warning, it came with teeth. By 10 o'clock, the Wyoming Highway Patrol had closed Interstate 80 from Rawlins to Cheyenne. By 11, the secondary routes choked with black ice and drifting snow until every road east of the Wind River Range became a frozen throat that swallowed anything stupid enough to move through it. Truckers pulled over in clusters at rest stops like circled wagons. Families idled in gas station lots with their hazards blinking into the white nothing. Radio stations looped the same emergency broadcast until the static ate those too. Bear Whitaker didn't stop. He rode a 2004 Harley Road King through the worst of it. Not because he was brave, not because he was reckless, but because a man with nowhere to sleep and nothing waiting for him at the other end of any highway didn't get to be picky about weather. The wind hit him in sheets. Ice formed on his handlebars faster than his left glove could scrape it free. His right hand had 2 pins in the knuckles from a deployment injury 16 years back, and in cold like this, the metal inside his bones ached with a specific cruelty that felt personal, like the war was still reaching for him across the years. He was 44, 6'3", 230 pounds of scar tissue, silence and bad decisions held together by black leather and engine grease. His cut bore the patch of the Iron Passage MC, a loose brotherhood of veterans and outcasts scattered across the Mountain West who didn't run drugs, didn't run girls, didn't run anything except old highways between small towns where nobody asked questions and the coffee was cheap. He hadn't spoken to his daughter in 3 years. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours straight in 6. And he hadn't cried since the night he buried a friend named Colton Bryce outside of Sheridan in a rainstorm so heavy it felt like the sky was trying to wash the whole state clean of what they'd done overseas. Tonight, Bear was just trying to reach Cheyenne before the cold killed his battery. That was the entire plan. That was the whole ambition of his life at this particular moment, to not die on a frozen highway in the middle of nowhere with nobody knowing his real name. Then he saw the diner. Nora's place. A squat cinder block rectangle crouching beside the 2-lane like something that had survived out of spite. Neon sign buzzing half dead in the wind. 1 letter dark. Parking lot holding a handful of trucks, 2 SUVs, and a rusted Dodge Ram with Wyoming plates and a cracked taillight. Warm light bleeding through fogged windows. The kind of place that existed in every forgotten corner of America, where the coffee tasted like regret, and the pie was the only thing worth staying alive for. Bear pulled in. Not because he wanted to, because his hands had stopped working. He killed the engine and sat in the parking lot for 30 seconds, flexing frozen fingers inside his gloves, listening to the wind scream across the flatland like something wounded and furious. Snow piled on his shoulders. Ice cracked in his beard when he turned his head. He could feel his heartbeat in his damaged knuckles, slow and stubborn. The rhythm of a man who refused to quit but had forgotten why. He dismounted. Boots hit frozen gravel. The sound was swallowed instantly by the storm. Inside the diner was everything he expected and nothing that mattered. Fluorescent lights humming at a frequency that made his teeth ache. A counter with 6 stools, 4 occupied by truckers who looked like they'd been poured into their seats and left to harden. A jukebox in the corner playing something old and sad that nobody was listening to. The smell of burned coffee, bacon grease, wet wool, and the faint chemical sweetness of industrial floor cleaner. Nora Wickham stood behind the counter, mid-50s, silver-streaked hair, pulled back tight, arms like a woman who'd been lifting cast-iron skillets since before some of these truckers were born. She had the face of someone who'd stopped being surprised by anything that walked through her door about 20 years ago. She looked at Bear the way a lighthouse looks at a ship, noting its presence without particularly caring whether it survived. "Kitchen's closed," she said. "Coffee's on. Sit where you want." Bear nodded, didn't speak, pulled off his gloves and hung his wet jacket on the hook by the door. His iron passage cut stayed on. It always stayed on. The leather vest with its faded patches riding his shoulders like a second skin he'd earned with years of road and silence, and the kind of loyalty that didn't need to be spoken out loud. He chose a stool at the far end of the counter, back to the wall. Eyes on both the door and the dining area. Old habit, the kind of habit that got trained into you in places where sitting with your back exposed meant not sitting at all anymore. Nora poured his coffee without asking. Black. No sugar. The mug was chipped and the handle was loose, and the coffee tasted like someone had boiled asphalt and added a prayer. Bear drank it like medicine. That's when he saw the girl, last booth, near the window. Purple winter coat 3 sizes too big, hanging off her shoulders like a tent draped over a fence post. Torn gloves sitting on the table beside a glass of milk she hadn't touched. Brown hair falling across her face in tangles that hadn't seen a brush in days. Small, pale. The kind of thin that didn't come from being a picky eater. The kind that came from not eating enough, period. She was maybe 8 years old, and her eyes were wrong. Not scared. That was the thing that hooked Bear's attention and wouldn't let go. A scared child fidgets, cries, looks around for help. This girl sat perfectly still with her hands in her lap and her spine straight and her gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, like she'd been taught that stillness was survival. Like she'd learned through repetition and punishment that the safest thing a small body could do in a dangerous world was become invisible. Bear knew that look. He'd worn it himself in a basement in Kandahar when the lights went out, and the questions started, and the only thing keeping him alive was his ability to become nothing. No expression, no reaction, no proof that he still existed inside his own skin. That was not the posture of a child having a late dinner with her mother. That was the posture of a prisoner. Beside the girl sat a woman, early 30s maybe. Blonde hair clean and styled, wool coat expensive and fitted, smile wide and warm and absolutely perfect in a way that made the back of Bear's neck tighten with the same instinct that used to save his life in combat. The instinct that said something in this picture is staged. The woman looked like a catalog mother, the kind you'd see in a dentist's waiting room magazine. Composed, gentle, radiating the exact frequency of maternal warmth that would make any stranger in any diner in any state glance over and think, nice family, hope they get home safe. Except the girl's body was angled away from her. Not dramatically, not obviously. Just enough that Bear's trained eye caught the geometry of it, the way the child's shoulders turned 2 degrees toward the wall, the way her knees pointed at the window instead of toward the woman beside her. The way her hands stayed hidden beneath the table edge, even when there was no reason to hide them. And then the girl signed. Bear almost missed it. The movement was tiny, practiced, buried beneath the table where no one above counter height would ever notice. 2 small hands forming letters against her thigh with the desperate precision of someone sending a message through a wall. N-O-T-M-Y. M-O-M. Bear's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down, quietly. The ceramic barely clicked against the counter. But inside his chest, something very old and very damaged shifted like a fault line moving deep underground. The kind of shift that doesn't make noise until the whole landscape cracks apart. He knew American Sign Language, had learned it in a VA hospital in Billings while recovering from his second surgery, taught by a deaf veteran named Marcus, who'd lost his hearing to an IED, and his faith in the system to everything that came after. Bear had never expected to use it outside of that hospital, had never expected it to matter. It mattered now. He didn't react, didn't stare, didn't do anything that would alert the woman. He lifted his coffee, drank, set it down, and let his eyes drift across the diner like a man with nowhere to be and nothing on his mind. Trucker at the counter arguing about the Broncos. Another one asleep with his face on his forearm. Nora wiping down the coffee maker with a rag that had seen better decades. Wind rattling the windows like something trying to get in. Nobody else had seen it. Nobody else was looking. Bear's pulse didn't quicken. That was the thing about men who'd spent years in combat. The adrenaline didn't hit the same way anymore. It didn't spike and crash. It rose slow and cold and settled into the muscles like ice water, sharpening everything, narrowing the world to angles and distances and the precise location of every exit in the room. 2 doors. Front and a kitchen service entrance behind the counter. The woman's SUV was the silver Chevy Tahoe parked closest to the exit. He'd clocked it on the way in without knowing why. Windows tinted, out-of-state plates. Colorado, maybe. He couldn't be sure from this angle. He needed to be sure. He needed to be sure about a lot of things before he did what every cell in his body was already preparing to do. Because Bear Whitaker had made a mistake once. 7 years ago, in a town he would never name, he had seen something wrong with a child and he had hesitated. He had told himself it wasn't his business. He had told himself the system would handle it. He had ridden away with the taste of cowardice in his throat, and 3 weeks later he'd read a newspaper article that put him on his knees in a gas station bathroom, vomiting until there was nothing left inside him but guilt and the cold understanding that silence was its own kind of violence. He would not make that mistake again. Not tonight. Not ever. Bear pulled his phone from his vest pocket. Reception was garbage. 1 bar flickering like a dying heartbeat. But he found the number and sent the text before the signal could collapse. Doc. Emergency. Nora's place, Route 287 south of Laramie. Child in distress. Not sure what I'm looking at. Need eyes, need backup. Come quiet. Doc Hanley, 61 years old. Former Army combat medic turned biker and part-time paramedic who rode with Iron Passage and maintained a network of connections across law enforcement, child protective services, and veteran support organizations throughout Wyoming and Montana. The kind of man who carried suture kits and lollipops in the same saddlebag. The kind of man who'd once set a broken arm in a parking lot and then testified in family court the next morning without changing his leather vest. If anyone could help Bear understand what he was seeing, it was Doc. The text sent. Maybe. The signal died before he could confirm. Bear pocketed the phone and ordered more coffee he didn't want. Watched the diner through the steam rising from the mug. The storm outside had become something biblical in scale. Wind shaking the building's bones, snow falling so thick the parking lot had disappeared, the neon sign buzzing and flickering like a mechanical seizure against the void. Nobody was leaving tonight. That was the only thing he was certain of. The woman seemed to know it too. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded on the table, and her smile never wavering, but Bear caught the way her eyes moved. Quick, calculating sweeps of the room every 45 seconds, cataloging faces, measuring threats, clocking exits. It was subtle, professional, the kind of situational awareness that didn't come from being a nervous traveler. It came from training. Bear felt the temperature in his blood drop another degree. He stood up, casually, stretched like a man working out road stiffness, walked to the restroom at the back of the diner, passing within 6 feet of the booth where the girl and the woman sat. He didn't look at them directly, but in his peripheral vision he caught 3 details that lodged in his brain like shrapnel. First, the girl's winter coat had no tags. The seams were wrong. It wasn't bought for her. It was put on her to match a description of what a child traveling with her mother should look like. Second, the backpack on the seat beside the woman was expensive, coordinated, and had a luggage tag with a name Bear couldn't read from that angle. But the girl had no belongings of her own. No toy, no book, no stuffed animal, no phone. Nothing that an 8-year-old on a road trip would carry. The child was traveling with 0 evidence of her own identity. Third, the girl's wrists. Bear saw them for only a fraction of a second when the child reached for her glass of milk. Thin red marks. Fresh. Not cuts. Ligature impressions. The kind of marks that came from being restrained with zip ties or thin rope and then covered with long sleeves and oversized gloves that sat on the table because the girl had finally taken them off in the warmth of the diner, not realizing that her wrists were telling a story she'd been taught to hide. Bear reached the bathroom, closed the door, pressed both hands flat against the sink and stared at his own face in the cracked mirror. Gray eyes. Hard. Damaged. The face of a man who had been broken and rebuilt so many times The original architecture was gone, and what remained was something functional but ugly, like a bridge repaired with mismatched steel that held weight but would never be beautiful again. His hands were shaking, not from the cold. He ran water, splashed his face, breathed. When he came out, he didn't return to the counter. He sat down at the booth nearest to the girl, one table away, facing the same direction, close enough to hear conversation, but positioned like a man who just wanted a quieter seat. The woman noticed immediately. Her smile didn't change, but her eyes did. Just for a microsecond. The pupil dilation of a predator registering a new variable in an environment she thought she'd already controlled. "Rough night out there," Bear said to no one in particular. His voice was low, graveled, the kind of sound that came from years of engine noise and cigarette smoke and not enough reasons to talk. "Terrible," the woman agreed. Warm voice, musical, practiced. "We were hoping to make Cheyenne by dinner, weren't we, sweetheart?" She looked at the girl. The girl nodded, small, mechanical. The nod of a child who had rehearsed the correct response. "My daughter gets carsick in snow," the woman continued, volunteering information that nobody had asked for, a classic tell that Bear recognized from 100 interrogation debriefs. People who were telling the truth didn't explain unprompted. People who were lying couldn't stop. "Long drive," Bear said. "From Denver. Visiting my sister in Sheridan." Bear nodded slowly. Denver to Sheridan. That was a northern route. You'd take a 25 up through Casper. You wouldn't be on Route 287 south of Laramie unless you were going east toward Cheyenne, or you were lost, or you were deliberately avoiding the interstate. He filed it away, said nothing. Nora arrived with a coffee pot and refilled Bear's mug without being asked. She glanced at the girl. Quick, professional, the way someone who'd worked roadside diners for 30 years learned to scan for trouble without making it obvious. "You need anything, hun?" Nora asked the girl. The child shook her head. "She already ate," the woman said quickly, smile widening. "Had a big lunch." Nora looked at the untouched glass of milk, looked at the girl's thin face, looked at Bear. Something passed between the diner owner and the biker in that half-second glance. Not words, not a plan, just the mutual recognition of two people who'd lived long enough and hard enough to know when something in a room was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Nora walked away. Bear heard her pick up the phone behind the counter. He couldn't hear what she said, but he saw her turn her back to the room and cup her hand over the mouthpiece, and he knew. She was calling someone. Minutes passed. The storm screamed. The jukebox switched to a different song, something with a steel guitar and a voice like whiskey on gravel. One of the truckers at the counter paid his bill and tried to leave, then came back inside 30 seconds later shaking snow off his hat, saying the parking lot was a skating rink and his rig wasn't going anywhere. Bear sat still, watching, waiting, running calculations in his head that had nothing to do with math and everything to do with survival geometry. The distance between the woman and the door, the distance between the girl and the counter, the number of steps it would take him to close the gap if the woman grabbed the child and ran. 7 steps. He'd counted. The girl signed again. This time she wasn't looking at Bear. She was looking at her own lap, her small hands moving against her thighs with the frantic rhythm of someone talking to themselves in the only language they had left. Bear caught fragments through the reflection in the window beside her, the glass acting like a dim mirror against the darkness outside. Scared. Cold. Want mama. Real mama. His throat closed. Real mama. Not this woman. Not this perfect, smiling, story-rehearsing, route-detouring woman sitting beside her with an expensive backpack and no child's belongings, and an answer for every question nobody had asked yet. Real mama was somewhere else. Real mama was looking for this girl. Real mama was probably losing her mind right now in some other state, some other town, screaming into phones that rang to voicemail, and filing reports that sat on desks and begging systems that moved slower than grief. Bear knew he couldn't act yet. Couldn't confront, couldn't accuse. Because if he was wrong, and he couldn't afford to be wrong, he'd be a felon biker harassing a mother and child in a snowstorm, and everything he was and everything Iron Passage stood for would burn in the headlines. But if he was right, And he waited too long, and that storm broke before the cavalry arrived. That woman would put the girl in the Tahoe and drive into the white nothing. And Maddie, that was the name the girl had signed earlier, he was almost sure, would disappear into a system so dark and so deep that no one would ever find her again. He was trapped between the wrong action and the worst inaction of his life. Then his phone buzzed. One bar, one text, 40 minutes out, bringing Sullivan. Sheriff Mercer knows. Roads are death. Pray we make it. Doc was coming. Marion Sullivan. The Iron Passage chapter's unofficial child advocate. A 63-year-old former foster mother who had helped recover 11 children in the last decade through a network of bikers, social workers, and law enforcement contacts that operated in the spaces the system couldn't reach, was coming too. 40 minutes. Bear looked at the storm, looked at the woman, looked at the girl. 40 minutes was a lifetime when a child's safety balanced on the edge of a blizzard and a stranger's smile. He drank his coffee. He watched. He waited. And beneath the scarred surface of his stillness, a fury older than the war and deeper than the winter began to build. The kind of fury that didn't burn hot and fast like rage, but settled cold and permanent into the bones like a vow made in a language that only damaged men understood. He would not lose this one. The woman checked her phone, checked the window, checked the room. Her smile flickered for the first time, just a tremor, barely visible, like a crack forming in porcelain under pressure. She was calculating too, and somewhere in the math Bear could see it. The moment approaching when she would decide the risk of staying was greater than the risk of the storm. She was going to run. He could feel it the way old soldiers feel incoming fire. Not a sound, not a sight, but a change in the air itself, a tightening of invisible threads that connected predator and prey and protector in a geometry as old as the species. She reached for the backpack. Bear set his coffee down. The wind outside hit the diner like a freight train, and every light in the building flickered once, twice, and held. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. And in the silence between the wind's impact and the fluorescent lights buzzing back to life, the little girl in the purple coat looked directly at Bear Whitaker for the first time. Not signing, not hiding, not performing the rehearsed blankness she'd been taught, but staring at him with raw, unfiltered, desperate hope, pouring from eyes that had learned too young that most adults were either dangerous or useless. She was asking him a question without words. "Are you real?" Bear held her gaze. Didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't perform reassurance the way people who hadn't earned it always did. He just looked at her the way one survivor looks at another, across the wreckage. Steady, honest, and certain. And under the table where no one else could see, he signed 3 words back. "I see you." The woman stood up. "Come on, baby," she said, voice still warm, smile still perfect, hand reaching for the girl's arm with a grip disguised as tenderness. "Let's try the car. I think the roads might be clearing." The roads were not clearing. The roads were buried under 2 feet of snow and growing. Anyone with eyes could see that. But the woman's calculation had shifted. Whatever she'd seen in Bear's posture, whatever she'd sensed in the diner's changing atmosphere, had tripped a wire inside her professional calm, and now she was moving toward the exit with the practiced urgency of someone who'd done this before. Bear stood. Not fast, not aggressive. Just up. 6'3", 230, filling the space between the booth and the door like a wall of leather, and silence, and something the woman's training hadn't prepared her for. Not violence, not confrontation, but the absolute immovable certainty of a man who had decided. "No child leaves this diner tonight," Bear said. Quiet. Final. Like a door closing on every option she thought she had left. "Not until the sheriff clears the roads." The diner went silent. Every trucker. Nora behind the counter. The steel guitar on the jukebox. Even the wind seemed to pause, just for a second, as if the storm itself was holding its breath to hear what came next. The woman's smile didn't break, but something behind it did. Something in the architecture of her composure shifted, and for one raw, unguarded moment, Bear saw what was actually living behind those calm, practiced eyes. Not fear. Calculation. Cold, professional, operational calculation. The assessment of a person deciding whether to comply, escalate, or eliminate the obstacle standing between her and the door. She was not a mother. She was not a traveler. She was something else entirely. Something trained and funded and connected to machinery that Bear couldn't see yet, but could feel humming beneath the surface of this storm like power lines buried under snow, alive, dangerous, and far bigger than one woman and one child in a roadside diner. And the girl, Maddie, stood frozen between them, her small body trembling beneath the oversized purple coat, her eyes moving from the woman to Bear and back again with the terrified precision of someone who had learned that the space between two adults deciding her fate was the most dangerous place in the world. Bear didn't move. The woman didn't move. Outside, through the screaming white chaos of the blizzard, headlights appeared on the highway. Not one set, dozens. Moving slow, moving steady, moving through conditions that should have made travel impossible, approaching Nora's diner from both directions with the disciplined patience of something that had been called and was answering. Engines, deep, rumbling, the unmistakable harmonic of Harley-Davidsons and heavy trucks moving in formation through a storm that was trying to kill everything on the road. The woman turned toward the window. Her smile finally died. And Bear Whitaker, scarred, broken, sleepless, damaged, 3 years removed from his own daughter's voice and 16 years removed from the war that had taken everything soft inside him and replaced it with something sharp and permanent, felt the brotherhood arriving through the storm like a pulse in his own blood. Iron Passage was coming. But they weren't the only ones, because somewhere in the caravan of headlights pushing through that blizzard, mixed among the bikes and the trucks and the deputies and the desperate volunteers fighting their way toward a diner on a frozen highway, was someone else. Someone the woman recognized. Someone who made her face go white for the first time all night. And in that moment, Bear understood that whatever he'd walked into at Nora's place wasn't a simple abduction. It wasn't one woman and one stolen child. It was a thread, and the other end of that thread disappeared into a darkness so vast and so organized that the blizzard outside was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break open inside this diner. The girl grabbed Bear's hand, small fingers, ice cold, holding on with the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose, and Bear held back. The girl's fingers didn't let go. Bear stood in the center of Nora's diner with Maddie's hand locked around his like a clamp forged from terror and the last shred of trust left inside a body that had been taught to trust nothing. Her grip was so tight he could feel the small bones shifting beneath her skin, and he didn't adjust, didn't squeeze back too hard, didn't do anything except hold on with the precise pressure of a man who understood that this child's hand in his was not affection. It was a survival mechanism. She had chosen him as the wall between her body and the door, and if he moved, if he flinched, if he broke that contract by even a fraction of an inch, she would shatter in a way that no amount of rescue could repair. The woman hadn't moved either. She stood half-turned toward the window, her coat already buttoned, the backpack slung over one shoulder, her body angled toward the exit in the posture of someone whose escape plan had just been cut in half by a wall of headlights pushing through the storm. Her smile was gone now. What replaced it was something Bear had seen only a few times in his life. The flat, efficient calm of a professional recalculating in real time. "You don't want to do this," she said, not pleading, not threatening, just informing him, the way a mechanic might tell you a bolt was stripped. Factual, detached, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Sit down," Bear said. "That's my daughter. You're interfering with—" "Sit down." The second time had no volume change, no shift in pitch, but something in the basement of his voice dropped a floor deeper, and the 2 truckers nearest the door both looked up from their coffee with the startled attention of men who just realized the biggest thing in the room wasn't the storm. Nora came around the counter, not fast, not slow, just present. She carried the coffee pot in one hand and a cordless phone in the other, and she set both on the nearest table with the careful precision of a woman establishing inventory. "Sheriff's been called," Nora said. "Roads are closed. Mercer's got deputies staging at the junction, but they can't move yet. Nobody's going anywhere." The woman's eyes flicked to the phone, to Nora, to Bear, back to the window where those headlights were growing larger and brighter through the white curtain of the blizzard. "This is a misunderstanding," the woman said. Her voice had recalibrated, warmer now, confused. the pitch of a concerned mother dealing with overzealous strangers. I don't know what you think is happening here, but Maddie is my daughter and we've been driving since— Her name, Bear said. The woman stopped. What? You just called her Maddie. Nobody in this diner said her name. Silence. The kind that doesn't land soft. The kind that cracks against the floor like a dropped glass and leaves every ear in the room ringing with the sound of something that can't be taken back. The woman's mouth opened, closed, opened again. And in that 2-second gap, Bear watched a professional liar run through every possible recovery and find none that fit. She told the waitress earlier. When we first— She didn't, Nora said from behind the counter, arms crossed, face hard as the cinder block walls holding the building together. That child hasn't spoken a word since you two walked in 4 hours ago. Not one. 4 hours. Bear filed it. They'd been here 4 hours, waiting out the storm or waiting for something else. A contact, a rendezvous, a vehicle swap that the blizzard had delayed. The woman straightened. The performance dropped from her face like a mask falling from a hook, and what stared back at Bear and Nora and the truckers and the little girl gripping a stranger's hand was something stripped of pretense, not panicked, not desperate, but coldly, efficiently furious in the way of someone whose operational plan had just been compromised by variables she hadn't accounted for. You have no authority here, she said, voice flat, looking at Bear. You're a biker in a diner. You have no badge, no legal standing. If you physically prevent me from leaving with my child, that's kidnapping. You understand that, right? That's a felony. In this state with your record, and you have a record, I can see it on you. That's 20 years. Bear said nothing. Let go of the girl's hand and sit back down and I will walk out of here and nobody's life gets ruined tonight, including yours. She said it with the calm certainty of someone who'd delivered this speech before. Maybe not these exact words, but this exact calculation. The implied threat wrapped in legal language, the specific targeting of vulnerability, the reminder that the system would side with the composed woman in the nice coat over the scarred biker with the felony jacket before anyone even asked questions. And she was right. That was the part that burned. She was right about the system. She was right about his record. She was right about the optics. A patched biker holding a child's hand and blocking a woman from leaving a diner in a snowstorm would make exactly one kind of headline, and it wouldn't be the kind that used words like hero. Bear knew this. He'd lived on the wrong side of institutional assumptions his entire adult life. He'd been pulled over 900 times for the cut on his back. He'd been denied housing. He'd been flagged at border crossings. He'd watched courts assign credibility based on wardrobe and vocabulary and the absence of tattoos, and he understood with the bone-deep clarity of a man who'd been chewed up and spit out by every system designed to protect citizens that the woman standing in front of him held every card that mattered in the eyes of the law. Except one. He looked down at Maddie. Tell them, he signed with his free hand, the movement slow and clear and gentle in a way that his voice never managed to be. Tell them what you told me. The girl's eyes went wide. Her grip on his hand tightened until his knuckles ached against the pins inside them. She looked at the woman, looked at Nora, looked at the truckers who were now sitting up straight with coffee forgotten and mouths slightly open. Then she looked back at Bear, and in her eyes he saw the calculation that no child should ever have to make, the weighing of safety against punishment, truth against consequence, the desperate algebra of figuring out whether the adults in the room were strong enough to protect her from what would happen if she spoke. Bear held her gaze, didn't rush her, didn't push. He just waited, the way a man waits who has learned that the most important things in life happen in the silences between the noise. The front door slammed open. Wind and snow exploded into the diner like a detonation. Napkins flew off tables, the jukebox skipped. A trucker's hat blew off his head and tumbled across the floor. And through the chaos of cold and white noise, a figure filled the doorframe, massive, snow-caked, wearing a leather vest over a military surplus parka, carrying a medical duffel in one hand and a thermos in the other. Doc Hanley. He stood 6'5" and weighed somewhere north of 260, with a face that looked like it had been carved from sandstone by wind and bad luck, and a beard that would have made a lumberjack feel inadequate. His eyes were small and sharp, and set deep beneath a brow that seemed permanently furrowed, as if the world had been disappointing him for 61 years and he'd simply stopped expecting it to improve. Behind him, smaller but no less formidable, came Marion Sullivan, 63, 5'4", silver hair under a wool cap, hands red and cracked from cold. She wore an Iron Passage support patch on her denim jacket and carried a canvas bag that contained, Bear knew from experience, blankets, juice boxes, coloring books, a stuffed bear with one eye, and a prepaid cell phone loaded with the numbers of every family court judge, CPS supervisor, and child advocacy attorney in the state of Wyoming. Marion didn't look dangerous. She looked like someone's grandmother who baked too many pies and watched too much daytime television. That was the weapon. That was the whole strategy. Because children who'd been hurt by the world didn't trust leather and tattoos on first contact, but they trusted women who smelled like lavender and spoke in voices that had rocked babies to sleep, and who carried stuffed animals with missing eyes because perfection was suspicious, but damage was familiar. Doc scanned the room in 3 seconds. His eyes found Bear, found the girl, found the woman. "Drove the last 9 miles in first gear on black ice," he said, shaking snow from his beard. Sullivan threw up twice. "Don't ask about the truck. What have we got?" "Child signed distress," Bear said. "Low, controlled. Woman claims maternal custody. Story doesn't hold. Route doesn't match. Kid has ligature marks on both wrists." Doc's face didn't change, but something happened behind his eyes. A door closing, a switch flipping, a transition from the man who told bad jokes and carried lollipops to the combat medic who had performed field surgery in places that didn't exist on any map, and who understood triage not as a medical concept but as a moral one. What needs saving first? What can wait? What's already lost? He walked toward the booth, not toward the woman, toward Maddie. He moved slowly, keeping his hands visible, the duffel held low and away from his body, his posture deliberately unthreatening despite his size. He crouched 6 feet from the girl, which put his eyes below hers, a technique Bear had seen him use a dozen times with traumatized children, making himself smaller, less authoritative, giving the child the high ground. "Hey there," Doc said, voice soft. The gravel in it sanded down to something almost gentle. "I'm Doc. I'm a medic. I help people when they're hurt. Can I sit near you?" Maddie's eyes darted to Bear. Bear gave a small nod, barely perceptible, and Maddie's grip on his hand loosened by a fraction. "Don't touch her." The woman's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Don't you dare touch my daughter." "Ma'am," Doc said without turning around, "I haven't touched anyone. I'm sitting on a floor in a diner asking a child if she's okay. If that makes you uncomfortable, I'd like to understand why." The woman's jaw tightened. Her hand moved to her coat pocket. Not fast, not aggressive, but Bear clocked it instantly, and his body shifted 2 degrees toward her with the automatic precision of a reflex he couldn't turn off even if he wanted to. "Phone," Nora said from behind the counter. "Take your hand out of your pocket and put your phone on the table." The woman stared at Nora. "My diner," Nora said. My rules. Phone on the table." For 5 seconds, nobody breathed. Then the woman pulled her hand out slowly, holding a smartphone. She set it on the table. Screen down. Marion Sullivan had moved without anyone noticing. She was already seated 2 booths away, unpacking her canvas bag with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had done this exact thing in diners and hospitals and parking lots and courtrooms more times than anyone should have to. The stuffed bear with one eye sat on the table in front of her. Coloring books, crayons, a juice box. She didn't look at Maddie, didn't approach, didn't perform. She simply created a space, warm, visible, unthreatening, and let its gravity do the work. Bear watched the woman watching Marion, and in the woman's eyes he saw something new. Not the cold calculation from before, something sharper, something that recognized the specific choreography of what was happening. The medic on the floor, the grandmother with the comfort bag, the biker blocking the door, the diner owner controlling the phone, and understood that these were not random strangers improvising. These were people who had done this before. People with protocols and networks and the kind of practice coordination that only came from having walked this exact path through this exact darkness enough times to know where every shadow fell. The woman was afraid now, not of violence, not of arrest, of being known. You people, she said quietly, looking at Bear's cut, at Doc's cut, at the iron passage patch on Marion's jacket. You're that biker group, the ones who show up at court hearings. Bear said nothing. I've heard about you. You think you're heroes. You ride around in your costumes and you intimidate people and you play pretend savior because your own lives are so broken, you need someone else's tragedy to feel like you matter. The words landed like shrapnel. Bear felt them. Not because they were true, but because they were close enough to true to draw blood. There were mornings, cold mornings like this one, when he lay in whatever motel or campsite or fellow rider's garage floor, he'd crashed on and stared at the ceiling and wondered if the woman was right. If all of it, the rides, the court appearances, the midnight calls, the stuffed bears and juice boxes, and the careful choreography of rescue, was just elaborate self-medication. Damaged people finding other damaged people so they could feel less broken by comparison. He'd never resolved that question. He didn't need to resolve it tonight. Doc, Bear said. Doc was already moving. He'd shifted closer to Maddie, still on the floor, still below her eye line, still keeping his hands visible and empty. And he was looking at her wrists with the clinical focus of a man who'd assessed thousands of injuries in conditions far worse than a warm diner. Sweetheart, Doc said, can you show me your hands? Just hold them out. I won't touch. I just want to look. Maddie's eyes went to the woman. Baby, we need to go, the woman said. Smile back, voice honeyed. But beneath the sweetness, a tremor, faint, like a hairline fracture running through glass. These people are confused. They think they're helping, but they're making a mistake. We need to go find Aunt Lisa. Remember? Aunt Lisa is waiting. Maddie looked at the woman, looked at Doc, looked at Bear. And then she let go of Bear's hand. For one sickening second, he thought he'd lost her. Thought the programming had won. The rehearsed responses, the trained obedience, the survival instinct that told stolen children to comply because compliance was the only shield they had. But Maddie didn't move toward the woman. She extended both hands toward Doc, palms up, wrists exposed. The diner held its breath. Under the fluorescent lights, the marks were undeniable. Thin, symmetrical, reddish-purple impressions circling both wrists like bracelets made of pressure and time. Not self-inflicted, not accidental. The precise repeating pattern of zip ties cinched tight enough to restrain, but not tight enough to leave permanent damage. The work of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how much force to use. Doc didn't speak. He looked at the marks for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Bear. Then he stood up, slowly, and the gentleness that had softened his face while he talked to the child drained away, replaced by something that Bear had only seen a handful of times in 15 years of brotherhood, the expression Doc wore when he stopped being a healer and became what he'd been trained to be in a desert halfway around the world. Nora, Doc said, call Mercer again. Tell him we have confirmation. Tell him to bring CPS and a forensic interviewer. Already calling? The woman moved, fast, faster than Bear expected. She grabbed the backpack and lunged for the kitchen entrance behind the counter, the second exit, the one Bear had cataloged but couldn't cover while standing between her and the front door. She moved with the explosive, committed speed of someone who had accepted that the operation was blown, and the only remaining objective was extraction. Not of the child, but of herself. Bear didn't chase her. He stayed with Maddie. That was the calculation, and he made it in the fraction of a second it took the woman to clear 2 steps. The child mattered more than the capture. Maddie was the priority. Maddie was always the priority. But Nora Wickham had spent 30 years behind that counter, and she hadn't survived 3 decades of drunk truckers, domestic disputes, and bar fights spilling in from the highway by being slow. The coffee pot was in the woman's path before her second step landed. Not thrown, placed. Set on the edge of the counter with a flick of Nora's wrist that sent it sliding across the laminate surface and off the edge, shattering on the floor directly in the woman's trajectory, scattering hot coffee and broken glass across the tiles in a pattern that turned the kitchen entrance into a minefield of ceramic and scalding liquid. The woman pulled up short. Her shoes slipped on wet tile. She caught herself on the counter edge, and for one frozen second she and Nora stood 3 feet apart, face to face, with nothing between them but steam and broken glass, and 30 years of roadside survival staring down whatever training this woman had received in whatever dark institutional basement had produced her. "Sit down," Nora said. Same words Bear had used, different voice, but the same bedrock underneath. The absolute, unglamorous, immovable refusal of ordinary people to let a child be swallowed by the dark. The woman sat, not because she wanted to, because the math had finally, conclusively collapsed. Front door blocked by a 230-pound biker. Kitchen exit covered in broken glass and guarded by a woman with 3 decades of controlled violence in her eyes. Medical professional documenting evidence. Support network deployed. Law enforcement en route. Phone confiscated. Storm sealing every road. She sat in the nearest booth and folded her hands on the table and stared at a point somewhere beyond the wall with the expression of a person powering down, disconnecting from the scenario, retreating into whatever operational training had prepared her for capture and interrogation, becoming blank and unhelpful and legally inert. She would not speak again without a lawyer. Bear knew the type. Doc was back on the floor with Maddie, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, speaking to her in a low, continuous stream of words that Bear couldn't quite hear but could feel. The rhythm of comfort, the cadence of safety, the specific frequency of a voice that was telling a frightened child, without saying the words directly, that the worst part was over. Marian moved to the booth beside them. The stuffed bear appeared on the table, the crayons, the juice box. And without ceremony, without instruction, without any of the performative warmth that adults usually manufactured around damaged children, Marian simply sat and began coloring in one of the books herself. Slowly, quietly, like a woman who had nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do in the world than fill in the petals of a cartoon flower with a red crayon. 3 minutes later, Maddie reached for a crayon. Blue. She picked blue, and she began to color beside Marian without looking up, without speaking, without signing, just existing in a space that felt safe enough to allow something as ordinary and childlike as coloring in a picture, and Bear had to turn away because the sight of it, the sheer smallness and normalcy of a stolen child picking up a crayon, hit him harder than any bullet or fist or frozen highway ever had. He walked to the front door, pushed it open, stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall. Snow drove into his face, his eyes, his lungs. The parking lot was a white void punctuated by the shapes of buried vehicles and the idling rumble of engines from the convoy that had arrived while the standoff played out inside. Trucks, bikes on trailers, 2 pickups with plow attachments, a battered Suburban with iron passage plates and mud on the fenders, and standing beside it, smoking a cigarette with the casual indifference of a man who'd driven through a blizzard and wasn't particularly impressed, was a figure Bear hadn't expected. Reno Casillas, Iron Passage's road captain, 48, lean and angular with a face like a hatchet and eyes that held the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years looking into distances that contained things he'd rather forget. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 divorce, 1 dead son, 17 years old, overdose, found in a motel bathroom in Casper with a needle in his arm, and a note that nobody in the chapter ever discussed because the words on it were too heavy for even hardened men to carry. Reno and Bear had history, the complicated kind. The kind that sat between brothers like scar tissue, binding them together and keeping them apart in equal measure, each unable to fully trust the other because trust required vulnerability, and vulnerability required the admission that the worst things they'd done to each other hadn't been malicious, but had been failures of presence, failures of attention, the slow, catastrophic erosion of connection that happened when 2 damaged men spent too many years performing strength instead of asking for help. Reno. Bear. They stood in the snow, not looking at each other, looking at the diner. The way men do when the thing between them is too large to address directly, and the only way to coexist with it is to stand side by side and stare at something else. Doc called me, Reno said. Said you found something. Little girl, 8 years old, signs ASL, ligature marks, woman claiming custody doesn't match. Reno inhaled smoke, exhaled it into the storm. The cherry of his cigarette flared orange against the white. You sure? It wasn't a question. It was a door. An invitation to doubt, to second guess, to consider the possibility that Bear's trauma had colored his perception and that what he'd seen in that diner was projection rather than truth. Reno had been present for the last time Bear had been sure about something. 3 years ago, outside Thermopolis, when Bear had confronted a man he believed was hurting his stepdaughter, and the situation had exploded into violence and legal consequences, and a 6-month chapter suspension that had cost Bear his sponsor status and nearly cost Iron Passage its relationship with local law enforcement. The man in Thermopolis had been guilty. That came out later, in court, in evidence, in the child's testimony. But the way Bear had handled it, the fury, the broken jaw, the blood on the parking lot asphalt, had done more damage to the cause than the crime itself, because it gave every critic and every skeptic and every system insider who already viewed outlaw bikers as vigilante thugs exactly the ammunition they needed to dismiss the entire network. Reno had told him then, "You were right about the crime and wrong about everything else." Bear still heard those words on bad nights. "I'm sure," he said now. Doc confirmed the marks. Kid signed distress. Woman's story collapsed in front of witnesses. Sheriff coming? Mercer. 40-plus minutes ago. Rhodes might have him stuck. Reno finished his cigarette, dropped it into the snow, watched it die. How many inside? 4 truckers. Nora, Doc, Sullivan, the woman, the girl, me. Woman contained? Sitting. Won't talk. Trained. Trained how? Like us. Reno's eyes moved to Bear for the first time. In them, Bear saw the question that Reno would never ask aloud, because asking it would mean admitting that this situation had already grown beyond the parameters of anything they'd handled before. The question of whether the woman in that diner was freelance or organizational, independent or connected, a lone predator or a node in something networked and funded and protected by the kind of institutional infrastructure that bikers in leather vests didn't have the resources or the authority to dismantle. There's something else, Bear said. Reno waited. When the convoy pulled up, when she saw the headlights, she wasn't scared of us. She recognized someone. In the lights. Coming through the storm. Someone specific. Who? I don't know. But she went white. Not anger white. Not panic white. Recognition. Like someone she thought was dead or gone or out of play just showed up in her operation. Reno was quiet for a long time. Snow accumulated on his shoulders, in his hair, on the brim of the cap he wore beneath his helmet. The engines around them idled in the dark, and the storm continued its assault on the Wyoming flatland with the mindless persistence of something that would outlast every human decision made beneath it. Bear. Yeah. 3 years ago I told you something. I remember. I'm going to tell you something different tonight. Reno turned to face him, full, direct. The hatchet face holding an expression Bear had never seen on it before. Not warmth, not forgiveness, but something adjacent to both. An acknowledgement. You were right then, and you're right now. But this time we do it clean. No broken jaws, no parking lot justice. We hold the line until Mercer gets here, and we let the system work, and if the system fails, we document everything and we fight it in daylight. You hear me? I hear you. You believe me? Bear didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was complicated. He believed Reno meant what he said. He believed the protocol was correct. He believed in the principle of restraint and the strategic value of working within systems rather than around them. But he also believed, with the absolute cellular certainty of a man who had buried too many failures and carried too many ghosts, that systems failed children every single day, and that the gap between protocol and protection was a space where kids disappeared, and that the only thing standing in that gap tonight was a handful of damaged bikers in a frozen parking lot who'd driven through a blizzard because a 3-word text message told them a child was in trouble. I'll hold the line, Bear said. Reno studied him, then nodded. Once. They walked back toward the diner. Reno's hand found Bear's shoulder for half a second. A grip, brief and hard and wordless. The closest thing to an embrace that 2 men built from wreckage and pride would ever allow themselves. Inside, the warmth hit Bear's frozen skin like a slap. The scene hadn't changed. Woman sitting blank-faced in her booth, Doc monitoring Maddie from a respectful distance, Marion coloring quietly, Trucker sitting alert and uncomfortable and deeply uncertain about what role, if any, they were supposed to play in whatever was unfolding around them. But something had changed. Maddie was looking at the woman's phone. The phone Nora had made her put on the table. Screen down. The screen that was now lighting up, vibrating against the laminate surface with an incoming call that pulsed through the device and into the table with a sound like a mechanical heartbeat. Nobody moved to answer it. The phone rang 4 times, stopped, then buzzed again with a text notification. Then another. Then 3 more in rapid succession, the device shuddering on the table like something alive and agitated. Bear looked at Doc. Doc looked at Nora. Nora looked at the phone. The woman's expression hadn't changed, but her hands had. They were no longer folded on the table. They were flat, pressed down, fingers spread. The posture of someone bracing for impact. "Expecting company?" Reno said from the doorway, snow still falling from his shoulders. The woman didn't look at him. "Because somebody is real eager to reach you," Reno continued. "And in my experience, people who get that many messages that fast are either real popular or real late for something that doesn't wait." The phone buzzed again, and this time everyone in the diner heard it. Not just the vibration, but the faint, tinny sound of a notification tone leaking through the speaker. A custom tone. 3 ascending notes followed by a single low pulse. Maddie flinched. Not a startle, not a jump. A flinch. Full body, shoulders up, chin down, the instantaneous protective contraction of a child who recognized that sound the way combat veterans recognize specific calibers of gunfire. She knew that tone. She'd heard it before. And whatever it meant in the landscape of her trauma, it meant something bad enough to override every ounce of safety that Doc and Marion and the blankets and the crayons and the stuffed one-eyed bear had managed to build around her in the last 20 minutes. She dropped the blue crayon, pulled the blanket over her head, and disappeared. Bear felt the floor shift beneath him. Not literally. The building was solid. The foundation was concrete. The storm couldn't move it. But something structural in his understanding of the situation cracked and rearranged, and he realized with the cold, nauseating clarity of a man watching a map redraw itself in real time that this was not a single woman operating alone. That phone was a leash. The woman was not the handler. The woman was a courier. And whoever was sending those messages, whoever owned that 3-note tone that made a stolen child disappear under a blanket in pure reflexive terror, was the handler. The real one. The one with authority and infrastructure and the kind of operational reach that didn't stop at state lines or get stalled by snowstorms. And they knew the plan had gone wrong. Bear looked at the window. The convoy's headlights still glowed in the parking lot, engines idling, riders waiting in trucks and cabs for instructions. Beyond them, the highway stretched into white oblivion in both directions, invisible, impassable, buried. But not forever. The storm would break. Maybe in an hour, maybe in 3. And when it did, the roads would open, and whoever was on the other end of that phone would send someone else. Someone who wasn't a courier in a nice coat with a practiced smile. Someone who solved problems differently. Bear turned to Reno. Reno was already looking at him. And in the space between them, in the silence where the snow fell, and the phone buzzed, and a little girl hid beneath a blanket, because a sound had found her even here, even now, even inside a building full of people who'd driven through a blizzard to protect her. Both men understood the same thing at the same time. This diner was no longer a shelter, it was a position, and they were going to have to hold it. The phone stopped buzzing at 1:47 a.m. Not gradually, not a fade. It stopped the way a heartbeat stops, mid-pulse, absolute, leaving a silence so complete that every person in Nora's diner could hear the fluorescent lights humming above them like a mechanical nervous system running on borrowed time. Bear counted the gap. 5 seconds, 10, 30. A full minute of nothing. No vibration, no notification, no 3-note tone leaking through the speaker to remind Maddie that the world outside the blanket was still hunting her. The silence was worse than the buzzing, because silence from a handler didn't mean the handler had given up. It meant the handler had switched channels. It meant new instructions were being issued through a different line to a different asset, and whatever those instructions contained, they were being transmitted right now through the storm to someone closer, someone mobile, someone who didn't need roads to be clear, just clear enough. Reno understood this. Bear could see it in the way the road captain positioned himself by the front window, coffee untouched, eyes scanning the parking lot through frost-caked glass with the focused rhythm of a man running a perimeter check from inside a building he couldn't fortify. Every 30 seconds, his gaze tracked left to right across the visible landscape. Buried trucks, idling convoy vehicles, the flat white void of the highway beyond, cataloging movement, measuring distance, running the kind of tactical math that got drilled into you in places where the difference between landscape and kill zone was a matter of seconds. "How many riders outside?" Bear asked. 7 in vehicles, 2 in the Suburban. Paulson and Griggs stayed with the trailer rig. Reno didn't turn from the window. 11 total, including us. Armed? This is Wyoming. Everyone's armed. That's not what I asked. Reno turned, looked at Bear with the flat, measuring stare of a man deciding how much truth to distribute. Paulson's got a 12 gauge in his cab. Griggs carries. I've got my .45 in the truck. Everyone else, I don't inventory personal choices. He paused. You asking because you think we need them, or because you think I should have asked before we got here? I'm asking because that phone went quiet and you know what that means. Reno's jaw tightened. He turned back to the window. Doc emerged from behind the counter where he'd been using Nora's landline. The cell towers were either overloaded or frozen, and the old copper line bolted to the kitchen wall was the only reliable connection left in the building. His face carried the expression Bear had learned to read over 15 years of brotherhood, the specific configuration of tension in the forehead and compression around the mouth that meant the news was bad, and the delivery was going to be careful. Mercer's stuck, Doc said. Jackknifed cattle hauler on 287 about 9 miles north. Both lanes blocked. He's got 2 deputies with him, but they can't get around it. Plows dispatched from Laramie, but the driver's estimating 2 hours minimum. 2 hours. Bear let that settle into his body the way cold settles into metal, slowly, completely, changing the fundamental properties of everything it touched. CPS? Reno asked. Mercer called the county office. Caseworker on call is in Rawlins. That's 90 miles in good weather. In this, Doc shook his head. Morning, maybe. So we're alone. We're alone. The 3 men stood in the aisle between the counter and the booths, forming a triangle of silence and leather that excluded everyone else in the room. Not deliberately, not cruelly, but with the unconscious geometry of men who had spent years operating as a unit and who defaulted to formation when the situation compressed. Nora broke the triangle. She walked through it carrying a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of sandwiches assembled from whatever the kitchen still had. White bread, processed cheese, sliced ham that had probably been in the walk-in since Wednesday. She set the plate on the counter without ceremony and poured coffee into 4 mugs without asking. Eat, she said. Whatever's coming. It's coming to tired men or fed men, and I'd rather bet on the second. Bear took a sandwich, ate it standing. The bread was stale, and the cheese tasted like plastic, and the ham had the texture of something that had given up pretending to be food, but his body processed it with the mechanical gratitude of a machine receiving fuel. He hadn't eaten since a gas station burrito outside Rock Springs 14 hours ago. His hands were still thawing. His knuckles ached around the surgical pins with a deep, persistent throb that matched his heartbeat. Maddie was still under the blanket. Marion sat beside her, not touching, not talking, just present. A warm body occupying adjacent space, with the patient consistency of someone who understood that traumatized children didn't emerge on adult timelines. The crayons lay scattered on the table where Maddie had dropped them. The one-eyed stuffed bear sat propped against the salt shaker like a sentry standing guard over a territory the size of a diner booth. Bear walked over, crouched beside the table, pitched his voice low enough that only the blanket could hear him. Maddie? The blanket didn't move. I know you're scared. I know that sound scared you, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to help me because you know things that I don't, and the things you know might help me keep you safe. Can you help me? Nothing. Then, small, almost imperceptible, the blanket shifted. Not a nod, not an answer, just an acknowledgement that she was listening. That she was still in there, behind the wool and the darkness and the learned invisibility of a child who had survived by disappearing. Bear signed beneath the table, even though she couldn't see it. Force of habit, connection through language even when the channel was closed. The sound on the phone, the three notes, you've heard it before? A pause. Then the blanket moved. Up and down. Yes. More than once? Yes. Does it mean someone is coming? The blanket went still, completely, rigidly, breathlessly still in the way that living things go still when the predator's shadow passes over them. Not hiding, but ceasing to exist, reducing their presence to zero in the hope that whatever was hunting them would move past without noticing. Bear had his answer. He stood up, walked to Reno, leaned in close enough that his lips nearly touched the road captain's ear. Someone's coming. She knows the signal. The phone tone is an alert. It means an asset is en route. We need to move her. Move her where? Outside is a whiteout, and we've got no jurisdiction, no backup, and no legal. Reno, someone is coming for this child, right now, through the storm, and they're not going to knock on the door and ask politely. Reno's eyes held Bear's for 3 seconds. Then he crossed the diner to the front window and pressed his face against the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes to block the interior light. Can't see past the parking lot. Snow's too thick. Exactly. And if we can't see out, we can't see what's approaching. We're blind. Doc stepped in. I'll put Griggs on overwatch. He's got night optics in his kit. Since when does Griggs carry night optics? Reno asked. Since Fallujah. Man kept half his deployment gear. Says he sleeps better knowing it's in the truck. That's not sleeping better. That's pathology. Tonight it's useful. I'll radio him. Doc disappeared toward the back of the diner where Nora had a CB unit mounted on the kitchen wall. Old, battered, with a handset that had been repaired with electrical tape and persistence, but functional on the frequencies that mattered. Bear turned to the woman. She sat in her booth like a statue, hands flat on the table, eyes fixed on the middle distance, face empty of expression in the deliberate, practiced way of someone who had received resistance to interrogation training and was executing it with the automatic precision of muscle memory. She hadn't moved since Nora shut down her escape attempt, hadn't spoken, hadn't reached for the phone, which still sat on the table 6 inches from her fingertips, dark and silent now, its purpose apparently fulfilled. Bear sat down across from her. She didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't shift her gaze, didn't alter her breathing by a single increment. You're not going to talk, Bear said. I know that. You've been trained not to, and you're good at it, and I'm not a cop, so nothing I do here has legal weight anyway. You know all of this. You've calculated it. You're sitting there running the clock because you know that time is on your side as long as whoever you work for gets here before the sheriff does. Nothing. But here's what you haven't calculated. Bear leaned forward, not threatening, not performative, just close enough that his voice became the only sound in her world. I'm not trying to arrest you. I'm not trying to prosecute you. I'm not trying to build a case. I'm trying to keep that child alive through tonight. That's it. That's the whole thing. And whatever happens after, the courts, the charges, the system, I don't care about any of it right now. I care about the next 2 hours. So here's my question, and it's the only one that matters. How many are coming? The woman's eyes moved. Just the eyes, not the head, not the body, nothing else. Her gaze slid from the middle distance to Bear's face with the slow mechanical precision of a turret rotating to acquire a target. She studied him. Not his words. Him. His scars. His tattoos. The way his hands lay on the table with the scarred knuckles and the pins beneath the skin and the permanent tension of fingers that had done things that kept them from ever fully relaxing. She studied him the way a professional studies another professional, assessing capability, measuring threat, calculating the distance between what a man says and what a man does. You really want to know? She said, voice flat, almost bored. Yes? Then you should ask your friend. Bear went still. Which friend? The woman's mouth didn't smile, but something shifted in the architecture of her expression, a rearrangement of micro-muscles around the eyes and forehead that communicated, with surgical precision, the specific flavor of satisfaction that comes from knowing something your enemy doesn't. The one who called you here. The words sat in the air between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Bear felt them detonate in slow motion. Not an explosion, but an implosion. A collapsing inward, a sucking void that pulled every assumption he'd carried into this diner down into a dark space where the foundations of trust were supposed to be. I don't know what you're... Yes, you do. The woman's voice dropped. Not to a whisper, to a register. The register of someone delivering information that she knew would cause damage and wanted to watch it land. You drove through a blizzard because someone told you to. You came to this specific diner because someone knew the route. You found me because someone gave you the coordinates. Not destiny, not instinct, not your biker brotherhood radar. A tip. A specific, actionable tip that put you in this building at this time. Bear's mind raced backward through the night. He hadn't come to Nora's because of a tip. He'd come because his battery was dying and his hands were frozen, and the diner was the only lit building on the highway. That was random. That was chance. That was, except, Doc's response time. Bear had texted Doc from the bathroom. 1 bar. Signal dying. The message had barely sent, and Doc had arrived, with Marion, with supplies, with a full convoy behind him, in roughly 40 minutes. Through a blizzard. On roads that Highway Patrol had officially closed. 40 minutes from wherever Doc had been to this specific diner on this specific highway in conditions that should have made the drive physically impossible, unless Doc was already close, unless Doc was already on his way, unless Doc knew where to go before Bear told him. The cold that moved through Bear now had nothing to do with Wyoming. It started in the center of his chest and radiated outward through his limbs with the specific, terrible chill of a man feeling the ground beneath his trust begin to crack. He stood up, walked across the diner, pushed through the kitchen door where Doc was standing by the CB radio with the handset pressed to his ear, speaking in low, clipped sentences that stopped the instant Bear entered the room. Doc turned, looked at Bear, and in the old medic's eyes, those small, sharp, deep-set eyes that had assessed 1,000 injuries and triaged 100 crises, Bear saw something he had never seen before. Guilt. Not the reflexive, performative guilt of a man caught in a minor lie. The deep, structural, load-bearing guilt of a man whose entire foundation was shifting because a secret he'd been carrying had just become too heavy to hold. "How did you get here so fast?" Bear asked. Doc set the handset down. Slowly. The way a man sets down a weapon when he knows the fight is already lost. Bear, 40 minutes, through closed roads, with a full team, with Sullivan, with supplies specifically packed for a child recovery. How, Doc? It's complicated. Uncomplicate it. Doc exhaled. The sound was long and ragged, the exhalation of a man releasing something he'd been holding in his lungs for longer than tonight. Maybe weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. I knew about the girl. The kitchen went silent. Not the diner. The diner still hummed with its fluorescent lights and its jukebox and its truckers shifting uncomfortably in their booths. But the kitchen, the small, grease-stained, industrial-lit space where Bear and Doc stood 4 feet apart with 30 years of combined military service and 15 years of brotherhood between them, went absolutely, perfectly, devastatingly silent. "Say that again," Bear said. "I knew about Maddie before tonight. I've known for 11 days. Bear's hands dropped to his sides. His fingers curled into fists. Not to strike? Not yet. Not a decision, just the body's autonomic response to betrayal. The involuntary preparation for violence that happened below the level of conscious choice. 11 days. An informant in Cheyenne, law enforcement adjacent, not a cop, someone who monitors specific databases. Flagged a transport route. Child, 8 years old, deaf or hearing impaired, taken from Grand Junction, Colorado. The route was supposed to go north through Wyoming to a transfer point in Billings. But the storm rerouted them, pushed them east. I've been tracking the courier's phone for 6 days through a contact who, "You've been tracking her for 6 days and you didn't call me." "I didn't call anyone, not you, not Mercer, not the chapter." "Because the information came from inside a network that I can't burn, Bear. A network that has been feeding me routes and names and locations for 3 years. A network that has helped us recover 9 children in 2 states. And if I move too fast, or too loud, or bring in people who can't be controlled, the network collapses. The source goes dark. And every child on every route after this one disappears into a hole so deep that you let a child ride with a trafficker for 6 days to protect an informant. The words left Bear's mouth with a flatness that was worse than shouting. Shouting was emotion. Shouting was engagement. This was something else. The dead-level, affectless delivery of a man stating a fact so terrible that giving it emotional inflection would have made it survivable, and it didn't deserve to be survivable. Doc's face collapsed. Not dramatically. Not a movie collapse. Not a performance of anguish. It was smaller and more devastating than that. A subsidence. The slow sinking of features that had held their shape through 2 wars and 1,000 emergencies and the death of friends and the screams of children, finally giving way under the weight of a truth that had been eating the foundations from below for 11 days. "I was going to intercept tonight," Doc said. "That was the plan. The storm was supposed to push them to Nora's. My contact confirmed the route deviation 6 hours ago. I was already mobilizing the team. Your text came in while we were staging on the highway 12 miles south. You found her before I got here. I wasn't using you, Bear. I swear. You being in that diner was the one thing I didn't plan. But you planned everything else." "Yes. The convoy, the response time, Sullivan with the comfort bag. You had it staged." "Yes." "And Mercer? Is the sheriff really stuck, or is that part of your plan too? Keeping law enforcement away long enough for your informant network to clean whatever needs cleaning before the badges arrive?" Doc's silence answered the question. Bear felt something tear inside his chest. Not his heart. That was a metaphor for poets and people who hadn't been damaged badly enough to know the difference. What tore was something structural, something load-bearing, the specific connective tissue that held together his ability to trust the men he rode with, the brotherhood that had become his family after his actual family had collapsed, the belief, perhaps naive, perhaps necessary, perhaps the only thing keeping him upright on bad mornings, that Iron Passage operated on a code that prioritized children above all else, above strategy, above intelligence networks, above the calculated sacrifices of a man who had decided that some children could ride with their captors a little longer if it meant saving more children later. The calculus wasn't wrong. That was the horror. Doc's math might be right. The network might have saved more kids over 3 years than any single rescue could account for. The informant might be irreplaceable. The strategic patience might be, in aggregate, the moral choice when measured across the full landscape of children at risk. But Maddie had ridden with a trafficker for 6 days. 6 days of zip ties and fear, and a phone tone that meant someone was coming. 6 days of performing the right answers and sitting still and keeping her hands hidden because the marks on her wrist told a story that could destroy the operation. 6 days inside the belly of the machine while a man Bear trusted, a man Bear had bled for, ridden for, held vigil with over the bodies of friends, tracked her like a blip on a screen and calculated the optimal moment for intervention based on network preservation rather than the screaming, obvious, non-negotiable imperative of getting a child away from danger immediately, right now, today, no matter what it cost. Bear's voice, when it finally came, was barely audible. "Does Reno know?" "No." "Sullivan?" "Marion knows I have contacts. She doesn't know the extent. Nobody does. This has been my operation, mine alone, because compartmentalization is the only way to—" "Stop." Doc stopped. Bear pressed both palms against the kitchen wall. The cinder block was cold against his skin, rough, real. The texture of something solid in a world that had just liquefied beneath his feet. He breathed. 1 breath. 2. 3. Each one pulling air through a throat that felt lined with broken glass. In the other room, Maddie was coloring with a blue crayon. A child. An 8-year-old child who signed because the world had taken her voice and who hid under blankets because a phone tone meant the monster was close and who had spent 6 days, 144 hours, riding through the American West with a stranger who called her sweetheart and zip-tied her wrists when nobody was looking. And a man Bear called brother had known. "The woman said to ask my friend," Bear said, not turning from the wall. "She knew. She knew you were tracking her. Which means the network knows about you, Doc. Which means your informant is compromised, or was never really your informant to begin with. Which means this whole operation, tonight, the convoy, the interception, might not be a rescue." He turned. "It might be a setup." The color left Doc's face. Not slowly, instantly, like a switch had been thrown, like the blood in his body had received a command to retreat from his skin and gather somewhere deep and fortified where it could survive whatever was coming. That's not... She wasn't scared when the convoy arrived. She was scared when she saw someone specific in the headlights. Someone she recognized. Someone in your convoy, Doc. One of your people. Think about that. Think about what it means that a trafficker saw someone in an Iron Passage convoy and went white. Not because the rescue was coming, but because a face she knew from the other side of this operation was sitting in one of our trucks. Doc's mouth opened, closed. His hands, those massive, capable, surgeon-steady hands that had sutured wounds and held dying men and cradled newborns in field hospitals, were trembling. "Who did you bring tonight?" Bear asked. "Names. Everyone in the convoy. Now." "Bear, I vetted every..." "Names." Doc recited them. Paulson, Griggs, Vargas, the Kessler brothers. A prospect named Whitfield, Marion. 2 support riders from the Casper chapter who'd been visiting family in Laramie when the call went out. A man named Decker and a woman named Torres. "Decker and Torres," Bear said. "How well do you know them?" "Decker's been riding with Casper for 4 years. Torres is his..." "How well do you know them personally, Doc? Not their patches, not their chapter history. Them." Doc went quiet. The kind of quiet that told Bear everything and confirmed nothing. The silence of a man realizing in real time that the security he'd built around his intelligence network might have been breached from a direction he never thought to watch. "I need to see them," Bear said. "Right now." He pushed past Doc through the kitchen door, crossed the diner. Every head turned. Truckers, Nora, Marion, even Reno, who read the change in Bear's stride the way a soldier reads incoming weather and was already moving toward the door before Bear reached it. "What happened?" Reno asked. Bear didn't answer. He pushed through the front door into the storm. The cold attacked him with renewed violence, wind driving ice crystals into his eyes, snow packing against his chest, the temperature so far below zero that his wet eyes began to freeze in the corners before he'd taken 3 steps. The parking lot was a graveyard of buried vehicles and idling engines. Bear moved through it toward the Suburban with Iron Passage plates, where 2 figures sat in the cab with the heater running and the windows fogged. He yanked the passenger door open. A man looked up at him, 30s, dark-haired, lean, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that assessed Bear's face with a calm that didn't match the situation. Beside him, a woman with short black hair and a denim jacket with an Iron Passage support patch was holding a phone with its screen on, a phone displaying a map showing a blinking dot centered directly on Nora's diner. "Out," Bear said. The man, Decker, didn't move. His eyes held Bear's with a steadiness that was either innocent confusion or professional composure, and in the half-second it took Bear to distinguish between the two, the woman, Torres, locked her phone and slid it into her jacket pocket with a movement so smooth, so practiced, so utterly devoid of urgency that it confirmed everything Bear needed to know. Innocent people fumble. Innocent people startle. Innocent people drop things, or freeze, or overreact when a 6'3" biker rips their door open in a blizzard. Trained people lock their phones. "Out of the truck, both of you, now." "Brother, what's going..." Bear reached in and seized Decker by the collar of his jacket. Not with violence, with authority. The grip of a man who was done asking and had begun deciding. He pulled Decker from the cab the way you'd pull a nail from a board. Straight, firm, and final. And the man's boots hit the frozen ground with a crunch that was swallowed by the wind. Torres exited from the driver's side without being touched. She came around the front of the Suburban and stood beside Decker with the relaxed posture of someone who had been through scenarios like this before and had protocols for each one. Her hands were visible. Her face was calm. Her eyes tracked Bear, Reno, and the diner entrance in a rotation so subtle that only someone trained to recognize surveillance would have caught it. Reno appeared at Bear's shoulder. He took one look at Decker and Torres standing side by side in the snow, with their matching composure and their hands positioned just so and their eyes moving in coordinated sweeps, and his expression changed. "Doc," Reno said, turning toward the diner. Get out here. Doc came through the door, saw the formation in the parking lot, stopped. These two, Reno said, pointing at Decker and Torres. Yours? They volunteered when the call. Volunteered. Reno's voice could have frozen the storm. Two riders. Nobody in our chapter knows personally volunteered to join a child recovery operation in the middle of a blizzard, and you didn't think to verify them beyond patch history? Their credentials checked out, Casper vouched. Phone, Bear said, looking at Torres. The one you just locked. Give it to me. Torres didn't move. Her eyes went to Decker. Decker's eyes went to the highway. And that was the tell. Not the eye contact. The direction of it. Decker didn't look at Bear or Reno or Doc when the pressure arrived. He looked at the highway, at the road, at the direction from which something might approach or toward which something might flee. He was checking his exit. Reno, Bear said quietly, I see it. We're blown. I know. In the diner behind them, visible through the fogged windows in a rectangle of yellow light, Maddie sat in her booth with a blue crayon in her hand and a blanket around her shoulders, and a one-eyed stuffed bear standing guard on the table. She was coloring, head down, small, quiet, doing the only thing an 8-year-old could do while the adults around her rearranged the architecture of danger and trust and betrayal in a parking lot she couldn't see. Bear looked at her through the glass. Then he looked at Decker and Torres standing in the snow with their blown covers and their locked phones and their careful, coordinated calm. Then he looked at the highway, the dark, howling, invisible highway where the storm was doing the one thing storms always eventually did. Weakening. The snow was thinning. Not much. Not enough for most drivers, but enough for someone with the right vehicle and the right motivation and the right set of instructions received through a 3-note phone alert 20 minutes ago. Enough for someone who was already on the way. Bear turned to Reno, looked him dead in the eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, for the first time since Thermopolis, since the broken jaw and the suspension and the long, bitter silence between two men who couldn't forgive each other for being right about different things, Bear asked Reno a question without any armor on. What do we do? Reno looked at the diner, looked at the highway, looked at Decker and Torres, looked at Doc, whose face had aged 10 years and 10 minutes, whose hands hung at his sides with the trembling helplessness of a man watching his carefully constructed world disintegrate in real time. Then Reno looked at Bear. We hold the diner. We contain these two. We put Griggs on the highway with his optics, and we stop pretending this is a rescue. What is it? It's a siege. Reno turned to the convoy, raised his voice above the wind, not shouting, not commanding, but projecting with the specific authority of a man who had led convoys through combat zones and understood that clarity in crisis was the difference between survival and chaos. Paulson, Griggs, Vargas, Kessler, everyone inside. Now, leave the engines running. Men emerged from trucks and cabs like ghosts materializing from the storm, snow-covered, leather-clad, red-eyed from exhaust and cold and hours on frozen roads. They moved toward the diner without questions, without hesitation, with the bone-deep obedience of men who recognized the tone in Reno's voice and understood that the time for asking why had ended. Bear grabbed Decker by the arm and marched him toward the door. Torres walked ahead of them, unhurried, unfazed, moving through the blizzard with the calm efficiency of someone who had already accepted that this particular chapter of the operation was lost and was now managing the transition to whatever came next. At the door, Bear stopped, turned Decker to face him, leaned close enough that the words landed on Decker's skin instead of scattering into the wind. Who's coming? Decker's face held, blank, professional, trained. Who is coming for this child? Nothing. I will stand in front of that door until the sun comes up or the building comes down. I am not moving. She is not leaving. Whatever you think is going to happen next, rethink it. Because the man standing in front of you has nothing left to lose, and that's the most dangerous thing you'll ever face. Decker's eyes flickered. Just once. A micro-expression so brief that in any other context Bear would have missed it. But he didn't miss it. Because what flickered across Decker's face wasn't fear or defiance or contempt. It was pity. The specific, terrible pity of a man who knows something about the scale of what's coming and recognizes that the person standing in front of him, however brave, however committed, however willing to die, has absolutely no idea what he's standing in front of. Bear pushed him through the door. Inside, the diner had transformed, not physically. The same fluorescent lights, the same booths, the same counter with its chipped coffee mugs and its half-dead jukebox. But the energy had changed. The truckers, who had been passive observers for hours, were now sitting upright with the alert posture of men who'd caught the scent of something primal in the air. Nora had moved from behind the counter to the window, her arms crossed, her face set in the expression of a woman defending her territory. Marion had shifted closer to Maddie, her body angled between the child and the door like a human shield wearing lavender perfume and a denim jacket. And Doc stood alone by the kitchen entrance, separated, not by distance, by the invisible architecture of broken trust that had rearranged the room's social geometry in the 10 minutes since Bear had confronted him. Reno wouldn't look at him. The other riders, who didn't know the details yet but could feel the fracture in the Brotherhood's foundation the way animals feel earthquakes before the ground moves, gave him space without being told. Bear walked past Doc without a word, past the kitchen, past the CB radio, to the small, grimy window at the back of the building that looked out onto the service area behind the diner, a patch of cracked asphalt where delivery trucks once parked, now buried under 2 feet of snow and lit by a single bulb above the kitchen door that cast a yellow cone of light into the falling white. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, and he saw them. Headlights, not from the highway, from the county road that ran behind the diner. A secondary route, unpaved, barely maintained, the kind of road that locals use to avoid traffic and that didn't appear on most GPS systems, but that someone with specific knowledge of the area, or someone with an informant who had specific knowledge of the area, would know about. 2 vehicles, moving slow. Lights off until they turned onto the service road, then flaring on, high beams cutting through the storm with the aggressive brightness of vehicles that wanted to be seen, that wanted the people inside the building to know they were coming and to understand that the storm was no longer a barrier. Bear's hand found the kitchen wall, pressed flat against the cinder block. He could feel his heartbeat in his damaged knuckles, in the pins beneath his skin, in the old war injuries that never healed and never stopped reminding him that his body was a collection of repairs held together by stubbornness and scar tissue. He turned from the window, walked back through the kitchen, through the diner, past every face, Reno's hard and ready, Doc's shattered and gray, Marion steady and fierce, Maddie's hidden and small beneath her blanket. He stopped in the center of the room. 2 vehicles approaching from the rear service road. Lights just went on. They'll be at the back door in under 3 minutes. Nobody spoke. Then Reno stood from his booth and Bear watched something change in the road captain's body. A straightening, a settling, the subtle realignment of a man's skeleton and musculature as it shifted from peacetime posture to something older and harder and forged in a desert on the other side of the world. Paulson, Griggs, back door. Vargas, Kessler, front. Nobody enters, nobody exits. Doc. Reno paused, looked at the medic. The silence between them was heavy enough to bend light. Stay with the child. Whatever you've done, you're still the best medic we've got, and that girl might need you before this is over. Doc nodded. Once. His eyes were wet. He turned away before anyone could see. Bear moved to the center of the diner and crouched beside Maddie's booth. He signed under the table, slow and clear. People are coming. Bad people. We won't let them in. But it might get loud. If it gets loud, you stay with Marion. You don't move, you don't look, you color. You stay in the blanket. Can you do that? The blanket shifted. A small hand emerged. Just the fingers, thin and pale and impossibly fragile against the rough wool, and signed one word. Scared. Bear took her hand, held it, the way you hold something precious that doesn't belong to you and that you'd burn the world to protect anyway. Me too, he signed back. Then he stood, walked to the counter, picked up the coffee pot Nora had shattered earlier and held the broken handle in his hand. Not as a weapon, just as weight, just as something solid to grip while the world outside the windows filled with headlights and engine noise and the slow, deliberate crunch of tires on frozen ground, moving closer through the dark. The back door rattled. Not a knock, not a push. A rattle. The handle being tested, turned, evaluated by hands that were checking whether the obstacle was locked or merely closed. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a conversation and an entry. Every biker in the room turned toward the kitchen. And Bear Whitaker, 3 years estranged from his daughter, 16 years removed from war, 11 days late to a rescue he should have known about, standing in a diner that had just become a fortress, held by a brotherhood that had just cracked down the middle, understood with final absolute clarity that the man he'd been when he walked through that door 4 hours ago was not the man who was going to walk out. Whatever came through that back door in the next 60 seconds would require something he'd spent his entire adult life burying. Not violence. He had plenty of that. Not courage. He'd spent that currency so many times the coin was smooth. Something else. The willingness to stop being the man who ran from his own damage and start being the man who stood in front of someone else's. The back door rattled again, and Bear walked toward it. Bear's hand closed around the back door handle before the rattle came a third time. He didn't yank it open, didn't announce himself. He stood with his fingers wrapped around cold metal and his shoulder braced against the frame, and his breathing controlled to the shallow, rhythmic pattern that his body defaulted to when the distance between action and consequence collapsed to zero. The same breathing he'd used in stairwells in Kandahar, in alleys in Fallujah, in every dark doorway his country had ever asked him to walk through with nothing on the other side but the unknown and the almost certain promise that the unknown was armed. Behind him, Paulson and Griggs flanked the kitchen entrance. Paulson, 52, barrel-chested, former Marine infantry, hands like engine blocks, held a fire extinguisher he'd pulled from the wall mount, not because it was the best weapon available, but because it was heavy, immediate, and wouldn't put a bullet through the wall into a diner full of people. Griggs, younger, wiry, with the permanent 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd left parts of himself in places the VA refused to acknowledge, had his night optics hanging around his neck and a tire iron resting against his thigh, with the casual familiarity of someone reuniting with an old habit. The handle turned from the outside. Bear held it, felt the torque transmitted through the metal, deliberate, testing, the controlled application of force by someone who was assessing resistance rather than attempting entry. Not a panicked push, not a desperate shove, a professional evaluation of an obstacle. Then a voice, muffled through the steel door and the howling wind, but audible enough to carve its way into the kitchen. "Open up, County Sheriff's Office. We've got a welfare check on a minor." Bear didn't move. Behind him, Reno appeared in the kitchen doorway. His .45 was in his hand, not raised, not pointed, just present, held along his thigh with the muzzle down, and his finger indexed along the frame in the posture of a man who understood firearms as tools rather than statements. "Mercer's stuck 9 miles north," Reno said quietly. "His deputies are with him." "I know." "So whoever's behind that door isn't county." "I know." The voice came again, louder, more authoritative, the practiced projection of someone wearing a badge, or wearing the idea of a badge, which was a different thing entirely and far more dangerous. "Sir, we're responding to a report of a child in distress. Open the door, or we'll be forced to enter." Bear leaned close to the seam where the door met the frame. He could feel the cold bleeding through the gap, could smell exhaust and snow and something else, aftershave, faint, the kind of manufactured scent that belonged in an office building, not on a deputy standing in a blizzard behind a roadside diner at 2 a.m. "Badge number," Bear said through the door. Silence. 2 seconds. 3. "Sir, I need you to—" "Badge number, name, unit, dispatch confirmation code. Give me one of those or this door stays shut until I hear Mercer's voice on the other side." The silence that followed was longer this time. 5 seconds. 7. Bear could hear murmuring, low, clipped, the conference of multiple people recalibrating behind a door that wasn't opening the way they'd expected. Then a different voice, not louder, deeper. The voice of someone who'd been standing back, letting the first voice run the script, and who now stepped forward because the script had failed and the situation required a different register. Bear Whitaker. The sound of his own name coming through that door hit him like a physical blow, not because it was threatening, because it was informed. Whoever stood on the other side of the steel hadn't come with a welfare check template and a uniform. They'd come with his name, with specific knowledge of who was inside this building and what role he was playing in the obstruction of their operation. "You've got a woman in there who works for us," the voice continued. "You've got 2 of our people sitting in your custody without legal authority, and you've got a child who is the subject of a lawful custody arrangement that you are currently interfering with. None of this needs to be difficult." Bear looked at Reno. Reno's face hadn't changed. Still the hatchet, still the permanent squint, still the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by the world's capacity for organized evil about 2 decades ago. But his grip on the .45 had tightened by a fraction, and the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables beneath his skin. "How many?" Bear mouthed. Reno held up his phone. He'd texted Vargas at the front window. The response glowed on the screen. 2 vehicles rear, black SUV front just pulled in. 3 total visible outside. 3 vehicles. At minimum 2 per vehicle. 6 bodies on the exterior at a conservative estimate, potentially more. Against 11 Iron Passage members inside the diner, plus Nora and 4 truckers who hadn't signed up for any of this, but were now locked inside a building that was being surrounded by people who used children's names as operational designations. "You know what a lawful custody arrangement looks like?" Bear said through the door. "It looks like paperwork, court orders, social workers. It doesn't look like 2 SUVs approaching a diner from a service road at 2 a.m. in a blizzard with no dispatch confirmation and no badge numbers. Mr. Whitaker, my name in your mouth doesn't make you legitimate. It makes you informed. And the only people informed enough to know I'm standing behind this door right now are the people who put a tracking device in a courier's phone and sent 2 assets into my convoy disguised as riders. So let's stop pretending you're law enforcement and start talking about what actually happens next." The wind screamed across the back of the building, driving snow against the door in waves that sounded like static. Bear could feel the cold radiating through the metal into his hand, his arm, his shoulder, his chest, the storm reaching through the architecture of the building to remind him that the walls between inside and outside were thinner than they looked. "What happens next," the voice said, "is simple math. You have a building, we have time, the storm is breaking. In 90 minutes, these roads open. When they open, we leave. The girl leaves with us. Your people go home. Nobody gets a headline, nobody gets a record, nobody gets hurt. That's the offer." "Counteroffer," Bear said. "You stand in that parking lot until Sheriff Mercer arrives with deputies and CPS. Then you show your paperwork to people with actual authority, and we let the system sort it." Laughter. Not performative, genuine. The low, tired laugh of a man who found something authentically amusing in what Bear had just said. "The system," the voice repeated. "You want to involve the system. That's remarkable coming from a man with your jacket. Assault, resisting, contempt of court, failure to comply. You've spent your entire adult life on the wrong side of the system, Mr. Whitaker, and now you want to hide behind it?" "I'm not hiding behind anything. I'm standing in front of a door." The laughter stopped. 90 minutes, the voice said. Then this gets complicated. Footsteps, crunching snow, retreating, but not far. The engines of the vehicles behind the diner didn't start. They were staying, positioning, settling into a perimeter with the patient discipline of people who had resources and time and the institutional confidence that came from operating inside a structure that didn't answer to local sheriffs or biker brotherhoods or the temporary moral convictions of damaged men in frozen diners. Bear released the door handle, stepped back, looked at Reno. 90 minutes, Reno said. Maybe less. Storm's weakening. Mercer? 2 hours minimum with the road blocked. Maybe longer. So they get here before he does. That's their math, yeah. Reno holstered his .45. Not because the danger had passed, because the nature of it had changed. The gun was wrong for what came next. What came next wasn't a firefight in a diner kitchen. It was a clock. A slow, grinding, mechanical clock ticking toward the moment when the storm cleared and the roads opened and the people outside transitioned from waiting to entering, and the thin membrane of blizzard that had been protecting Maddie dissolved into navigable highway. They walked back into the main room. The diner was silent in the specific way that buildings full of frightened people are silent. Not empty silent, but pressurized silent. The held breath of a dozen bodies trying to take up less space in the air. The truckers sat rigid in their booths. Nora stood behind the counter with her hands flat on the surface and her weight forward on her toes, a woman balanced between retreat and engagement, who had chosen engagement and was waiting for someone to tell her what engagement looked like. The Kessler brothers, twins, mid-40s, identical builds and matching expressions of coiled, restrained fury, flanked the front door like bookends made of scar tissue and bad memories. Marion hadn't moved from Maddie's side. The child was still under the blanket, still invisible, still existing in the only safe space she'd been able to construct. A wool cocoon in a diner booth surrounded by strangers who smelled like leather and engine oil, and who were arguing about how to keep her alive. Decker and Torres sat in the booth nearest the counter, contained but not restrained. There were no zip ties, no handcuffs, no physical bonds, just the social geometry of a room full of bikers who had positioned themselves at every angle of approach, and who communicated through glances and slight adjustments of posture that the two operatives were free to sit, but not free to move. Torres was calm. She sat with her hands on the table and her legs crossed and her expression set to the same professional blankness the courier woman had adopted. The default mode of someone trained to be captured, trained to wait, trained to give nothing, and cost everything in time and uncertainty while the cavalry approached. Decker was less composed. His eyes moved too much. His jaw worked in small, grinding circles, the involuntary tension of a man whose operational composure was eroding under the specific pressure of being surrounded by people who were not law enforcement, not military, not bound by the rules of engagement he'd been trained to expect, people who operated in the gray spaces between systems, who answered to codes that couldn't be cited in court, and whose capacity for violence was contained not by regulation, but by choice, which meant it could be unchoiced at any moment. Bear sat down across from Decker. "The man outside. The one who knows my name. Who is he?" Decker's jaw stopped working, his eyes fixed on a point above Bear's left shoulder. "You've been in this room for 2 hours. You've watched us. You know who we are. You know we're not going to hurt you. But the people outside, the people you work for, they don't have that restraint. And when they come through that door, they're not going to distinguish between assets and obstacles. Everyone in this room becomes a problem, including you. Nothing. You're a tool to them. You understand that, right? You and Torres and the woman in the nice coat. You're all expendable components in a logistics chain. When this operation burns, they don't send lawyers. They send cleaners. And cleaners don't leave witnesses." Decker's eyes moved. Not to Bear, to Torres. A glance so quick and so weighted that it carried the mass of a conversation in a fraction of a second. Torres didn't return it. She stared straight ahead, her face a mask, but Bear caught the micro tremor in her left hand, the ring finger tapping against the table surface in a rhythm that was too regular to be random and too irregular to be Morse, and was probably just the physical manifestation of adrenaline trying to escape through the smallest available outlet. She was scared, not of the bikers, not of Bear, not of the situation in the diner, of what was outside. "Torres," Bear said. She didn't look at him. "You're afraid of them, the people you work for. I can see it. That tremble in your hand, you can't stop it because your body knows something your training won't let your mouth say. Your body knows that when this is over, you're not going home. You're not getting paid. You're getting silence. The permanent kind." Torres's hand stopped trembling. She pressed it flat against the table and held it there with conscious effort, the muscles in her forearms standing taut beneath her skin. "I can't protect you from what happens after tonight," Bear continued. "I'm not law enforcement. I'm not the system. But I can protect you right now, in this building, for the next 90 minutes, and that's more than the man outside is offering." Torres looked at him. For the first time since Bear had pulled them from the truck, she actually looked at him, not assessed him, not evaluated him, but saw him, The way one human being sees another when the professional layers are stripped back and the only thing left is the raw, terrified calculation of survival. "There are 6 outside," she said. Decker's head snapped toward her. "Torres, shut up." She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Bear. 6. The 2 at the back door. 2 in the SUV out front. 2 more in the vehicle that pulled in from the county road. The one who talked to you through the door. His name is Harlan. Harlan Mace. He runs logistics for a private placement network operating out of Denver. Children. Mostly from rural areas, mostly from families that the system already failed. Foster kids, custody disputes, undocumented parents, kids that nobody looks for hard enough when they disappear. The diner was so quiet, Bear could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing above him like insects trapped in glass. Maddie was taken from Grand Junction 11 days ago. Her mother, her real mother, is a hearing-impaired woman named Claire Turner. Single parent, works 2 jobs, filed a missing persons report that sat on a desk for 4 days before anyone moved on it. By then, Maddie was already in the pipeline. Pipeline to where? Torres's eyes went flat. Not blank, flat. The specific flatness of someone staring at information so ugly that the eyes refused to process it in full resolution and instead reduced it to data points that could be transmitted without the transmitter having to feel them. Private adoption. Off-book. Wealthy families in 3 states who pay 6 figures for healthy children with no digital footprint and no family connection strong enough to trigger a real search. Maddie's hearing impairment made her high value, harder for her to communicate, harder for her to tell anyone what happened, easier to disappear. Bear's vision went white at the edges. Not rage, something older than rage. Something pre-verbal and pre-conscious that lived in the part of the brain that hadn't changed since humans were animals, in dark places protecting their young from predators. The part that didn't calculate or strategize or weigh consequences, but simply recognized the presence of a threat to a child and responded with the full, primitive, ungovernable force of biological imperative. He breathed, forced the white back from the edges, forced his hands to stay flat on the table instead of curling into the fist that his body was demanding. "Doc's informant," Bear said. "The one who fed him the route. Part of the network?" Torres nodded. "Harlan uses informants the way intelligence agencies use double agents. Your friend's contact was feeding real information, real routes, real names, but on a schedule. Only the routes that Harlan wanted disrupted. The ones carrying children he'd already been paid for went through clean. The ones carrying children from families who might actually fight back, who might attract media attention, who might make enough noise to threaten the network, those got leaked. Your friend has been intercepting the decoys for 3 years. The real cargo moved behind him the whole time." Bear closed his eyes. 3 years. Doc's network. Doc's careful, compartmentalized, strategically patient intelligence operation. 9 children recovered. 9 victories celebrated in quiet parking lots and church basements, and the private, unspoken satisfaction of men who believed they were making a difference. And behind every recovery, behind every intercepted route, behind every child pulled from the pipeline and returned to the light, the real pipeline kept running, kept moving, kept swallowing children from the margins of a broken system and delivering them into the hands of people who could afford to buy what they wanted and who had hired men like Harlan Mace to ensure the supply never stopped. Doc hadn't been running an intelligence operation. He'd been part of the cover. Bear opened his eyes, stood, walked to the kitchen where Doc stood alone by the CB radio, his massive frame seeming somehow diminished, his shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the medical duffel at his feet. "You heard?" Doc nodded. 3 years, 9 kids, decoys. "I didn't know." Doc's voice cracked on the last word. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical fracture of a man performing anguish, but with the small structural failure of a voice that had been holding itself together through 61 years of service and sacrifice and the specific terrible faith that the work mattered. "Bear, I swear to you, I didn't know. I thought the information was good. The rescues were real. Those children were real. Those families got their kids back because someone decided they were acceptable losses. Distractions. Noise to cover the signal. Bear's voice was low and steady and completely without mercy. You weren't saving kids, Doc. You were sorting them, and someone else decided which pile they went in. Doc's knees buckled. Not a collapse, a partial failure, a momentary giving way that he caught by grabbing the edge of the counter, his massive hand gripping the laminate with enough force to whiten his knuckles. He stayed upright. Barely. The way a building stays upright after the foundation cracks, through inertia and habit, and the structural memory of what it used to be before the ground shifted. "What do I do?" Doc whispered. Bear looked at him for a long time, looked at the hands that had sutured wounds and held dying men and carried comfort bags into dark situations, looked at the patches on his vest, the Iron Passage insignia, the medical cross, the small embroidered angel wing that somebody's wife had stitched for him after he'd helped recover her nephew from a custody dispute in Bozeman. Looked at the man beneath the patches and the guilt and the devastating revelation of his own manipulation. "You do what medics do," Bear said. "You stay ready, because when they come through that door, people are going to get hurt, and you're going to fix them. That's your job. That's the only job that matters right now." Doc straightened, drew a breath that sounded like it was pulled through broken glass, and nodded. Bear walked back into the dining room. Every face turned to him, every eye. Reno by the window, the Kessler brothers at the door, Paulson and Griggs emerging from the kitchen behind him, Vargas by the jukebox, Nora behind her counter, Marion beside a blanket-covered child. 4 truckers who had no training, no preparation, and no reason to be involved in any of this except the catastrophic bad luck of choosing the wrong diner on the wrong night. "Here's what's happening," Bear said. Not loud, not commanding, just clear, the way a man is clear when there's no time left for anything except the truth. "There are 6 people outside this building who are here to take that child. They're not law enforcement. They're part of a network that traffics children through the Mountain West for profit. The sheriff is stuck behind a wreck on 287. His deputies can't reach us. The storm is breaking, and when it breaks, those people will come through the doors. We have roughly 60 to 70 minutes. He paused. "Let it settle. Nobody in this room signed up for this. The truckers didn't. Nora didn't. Some of you rode through a blizzard because a text said a child needed help, and what you found is bigger and uglier and more dangerous than any of us expected. If anyone wants to leave, right now, through the front door, hands up, no leather showing, I won't stop you. I won't judge you. This is not your fight." Silence. One of the truckers, a heavy man in a flannel shirt with a Peterbilt cap and hands like catcher's mitts, shifted in his booth, looked at the door, looked at Maddie's booth, looked back at Bear. "I got a daughter," the trucker said. "She's 11. Lives with her mom in Cheyenne." He swallowed. "I ain't going nowhere." The second trucker nodded without speaking. The third, young, maybe 25, skinny, with the hollowed-out look of someone running on coffee and methamphetamine and the kind of desperation that came from driving loads too heavy on too little sleep, just gripped the edge of his table and set his jaw. The fourth trucker was already asleep, or pretending to be. Bear left him alone. Nora reached beneath the counter and produced a baseball bat. Aluminum, dented. She set it on the counter beside the coffee pot with the casual authority of a woman adding another tool to an already well-equipped workstation. 30 years behind this counter, she said. 3 attempted robberies, 2 domestic incidents, and 1 idiot who tried to grab my waitress in the parking lot. I am not in the habit of letting people take things from my building. Reno stepped into the center of the room. He and Bear stood side by side, not looking at each other, looking at the same direction, the way they'd stood in the parking lot earlier. The way men stand when the thing between them is too large and too complicated to address directly, but the thing in front of them is immediate enough to demand unity. "We can't fight them head on," Reno said. 6 against us, we've got numbers, but they've got training and they've got the approach advantage. If they come through both doors simultaneously, we've got a crossfire situation in a room full of civilians and a child. That's not a fight. That's a massacre with extra casualties. So we don't let them in. Doors won't hold if they're serious. Then we make being serious expensive. Bear's mind was working in the mode it hadn't accessed in 16 years. The tactical mode, the operational mode, The specific neural configuration that had been drilled into him in desert warfare training and refined in urban combat and then carefully, deliberately, painstakingly suppressed during 15 years of civilian life. Because the man who lived in that mode was a man who broke jaws in parking lots and lost custody of his daughter, and spent nights staring at ceilings counting the faces of people he'd hurt in the name of protection. But the man who lived in that mode was also the man who kept people alive. Nora, your generator, propane or diesel? Diesel. Out back. 200-gallon tank. Kill it. What? Kill the generator. Cut the power. When they move on this building, they're going to expect light. They're going to expect visibility. They've been watching the diner from outside, seeing our positions, counting heads, mapping the layout through the windows. We take the lights away. We take their map away. Nora stared at him, then walked to the kitchen without another word. 30 seconds later, the diner went dark. Not completely. The neon sign outside still buzzed with its half-dead glow, casting a faint red pulse through the front windows that made the room look like the inside of a heart. The jukebox died mid-note. The fluorescent hum vanished. The refrigeration units in the kitchen wound down with a descending mechanical groan that sounded like the building exhaling its last breath. And in the darkness, the diner transformed. What had been a vulnerable fishbowl, lit from within, every body visible, every position mapped, became something else. A box of shadows and sound. The tables and booths became obstacles. The counter became a barricade. The darkness became an equalizer that removed the outsider's informational advantage and replaced it with the specific, intimate familiarity of people who had been inside this building for hours and whose eyes were already adapted. Bear moved through the dark with the confidence of a man who had memorized the room's geometry 4 hours ago without consciously deciding to. 14 steps from the front door to the counter, 7 from the counter to Maddie's booth, 11 from the booth to the kitchen entrance. The back door was 32 feet from the front door in a straight line through the building. Every table, every stool, every booth, mapped in his muscle memory like a terrain grid. Vargas, Kessler, upend the tables nearest both doors, create a funnel. Anyone coming through has to navigate obstacles before they reach the main floor. Furniture scraped across wood. Tables flipped. Booths repositioned. The Kessler brothers worked with the silent, synchronized efficiency of men who shared a nervous system, moving heavy furniture through darkness as if the room was lit by a sun only they could see. Paulson, Griggs, kitchen, back door is the primary threat. They approach from the rear first. That's their preferred entry. Griggs, use the optics. I need eyes on the service road. How are they positioned? Griggs pressed the night vision monocular to his eye and scanned through the kitchen window. His report came back clipped, efficient, stripped of everything except utility. 2 figures at the back door, SUV running 30 yards out, driver in the cab. The second rear vehicle repositioned. It's on the north side now, blocking the county road. Front SUV hasn't moved. 2 visible inside, engine running. They're boxing us in. Textbook containment. Vehicle block on the only secondary exit. Primary vehicles covering both building entrances. If we try to move this girl by vehicle, they've got the roads. We're not moving her by vehicle. Everyone looked at Bear. Or rather, everyone turned toward his voice in the darkness, and the red pulse of the dying neon sign caught his face in intermittent flashes that made him look like something emerging from and retreating into shadow with each mechanical heartbeat of the buzzing sign. Nora, is there a cellar? Root cellar, under the kitchen, hatch behind the walk-in cooler, hasn't been used in years. Does it exit? Nora paused, the kind of pause that told Bear she was retrieving a memory from deep storage. Something old, something filed away decades ago and never accessed because it had never mattered until this exact moment, in this exact situation, on this exact night. There's a drainage tunnel, runs about 60 yards east, comes out in a culvert by the old fence line near the highway service road. My father built it in the 70s for flood runoff. It's narrow, maybe 4 feet high. I haven't been down there in 15 years. I don't know what condition. Good enough. Marion, can you move with Maddie through a 4-foot tunnel? Marion's voice came from the darkness beside the booth, steady and measured and completely without hesitation. I've crawled through worse to reach a child. Give me a flashlight and 60 seconds to get her ready. Doc, go with them. Take your kit. If anyone's on the other end of that tunnel, you handle it. Doc's voice came from the kitchen doorway, hoarse and broken, but functional. Copy. Reno. Here. We hold the building, we make noise, we keep their attention on the doors while Marion, Doc, and Maddie go underground. When they're clear, we pull back through the same route. And Decker and Torres? Bear looked toward the booth where the two operatives sat. In the red pulsing darkness, their faces were intermittent, visible, invisible, visible, like something flickering between existence and absence. They stay. They're our insurance. Harlan won't breach if he thinks we might have information from his people. That's a bluff? Everything about tonight is a bluff, Reno. We're 11 bikers in a diner playing chess with a trafficking operation. The only thing keeping that child alive is the fact that they don't know what we know and they don't know what we'll do. The second that uncertainty dies, they come through the walls. Reno was quiet for 3 heartbeats. Then Bear heard the sound of a hand extending in darkness, knuckles forward, waiting. Bear found the fist, pressed his own against it. The contact lasted 1 second. It said everything that 2 men with 15 years of complicated history and 3 years of bitter silence and 1 night of impossible circumstance needed to say to each other. We're here. We hold, whatever comes. Marion moved first. She was beside Maddie in the darkness, her voice dropping to the frequency she reserved for damaged children, low, warm, steady, the vocal equivalent of a hand on a shoulder that didn't press too hard. Maddie, sweetie, we're going on an adventure. It's going to be dark and small, and I'll be right behind you the whole time. Can you be brave for me? The blanket moved. A small head emerged. In the red neon pulse, Bear caught a glimpse of the girl's face. Pale, thin, eyes enormous in the darkness, reflecting the faint light like an animal caught between flight and freeze. Maddie signed. Bear read it in the flash of red glow. Where? Somewhere safe, Marion signed back. Her hands moved with the practiced fluency of a woman who had learned ASL, not from a textbook, but from years of sitting with children who had no other language left. Under the floor, through a tunnel, out the other side, like a rabbit going home. Maddie looked at Bear. In the darkness, across the room, through the chaos of overturned tables and positioned bodies and the red heartbeat of a dying neon sign, a child looked at a stranger and asked him the same wordless question she'd asked hours ago. Are you real? Bear signed. Slow, clear. Each letter formed with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that these might be the last words this child received from him and that they needed to carry enough weight to sustain her through whatever came next. I am real. You are real. Go now. I will find you. Maddie slid out of the booth. Marion's arm went around her shoulders. Not restrictive, not controlling, just present. The weight of a human body communicating through contact what words couldn't reach. Doc appeared from his kitchen with his medical duffel and a flashlight, and the 3 of them, grandmother, medic, and stolen child, moved into the kitchen toward the hatch behind the walk-in cooler, disappearing into the darkness like figures being absorbed into the building itself. Bear listened, heard the scrape of the hatch cover, the hollow sound of a void opening beneath the floor. Marion's voice, muffled, descending. Then silence. They were in. He turned back to the room. It's us now. Every minute we hold this building is a minute they gain underground. We don't need to win. We just need to last. The neon sign outside flickered, died, came back, died again. Came back one final time with a buzz so loud it sounded like the building was screaming, then went dark permanently, plunging the diner into complete, absolute, suffocating blackness. In the void, Bear heard breathing, the Kessler brothers by the door, Paulson and Griggs in the kitchen, Vargas somewhere to his left, Reno somewhere to his right, the truckers in their booths, Nora behind her counter, Decker and Torres in their contained silence. And outside, cutting through the storm with the surgical precision of trained operators executing a timeline that had just accelerated, the sound of vehicle doors opening. Multiple doors, front and back, simultaneously. They were coming. Bear gripped the edge of the counter, felt the worn laminate under his fingers. felt the solidity of the structure beneath it. Wood and steel and 30 years of Nora's life built into every surface, every wall, every bolt holding this building to its foundation. Nobody moves until they're inside, Bear said into the darkness. Let them commit. Let them enter. Then we make them regret it. The back door exploded inward. Not kicked, rammed. Something heavy and metallic? A breaching tool, a pry bar, something designed for exactly this purpose. Hit the steel door with enough force to blow the lock and swing the frame wide open, and through the gap poured cold and wind and snow and the silhouetted shapes of two men moving in tactical formation, low and fast, sweeping the kitchen with flashlight beams that cut through the darkness like surgical instruments. Paulson hit the first one with the fire extinguisher, not the canister, the discharge. He triggered the extinguisher point blank into the doorway, and the kitchen filled instantly with a white chemical cloud that blinded the flashlights, choked the air, and turned the entry point into a fog bank of industrial powder that coated everything: eyes, lungs, weapons, tactical goggles, with a layer of particulate chaos. The first man stumbled, coughing, hands going to his face. His flashlight dropped and rolled across the kitchen floor, spinning a beam of light through the chemical fog like a lighthouse in a cloud. Griggs hit him low. Not a punch, a tackle. The wiry veteran drove his shoulder into the man's midsection with the specific, practiced economy of motion impact of someone who had been trained to close distance and eliminate mobility without regard for personal safety. They went down together, crashing into the walk-in cooler door, and the sound of bodies hitting metal rang through the building like a bell. The second man cleared the fog faster. He came through the cloud with his flashlight raised and his other hand reaching for something on his belt. Not a gun, Bear registered in the fraction of a second he had to process, but a taser or a baton or something designed for compliance rather than elimination, because these were men who needed this operation to look like something other than what it was. Paulson was there. The fire extinguisher, now spent, became weight. The canister caught the second man across the forearm, the arm reaching for his belt, and the crack of impact was followed by a howl that was swallowed by the storm blowing through the open door. Front of the building, simultaneously. The front door shattered inward. Not the lock, the glass panel beside it, a boot going through the lower pane and a body following, compact and fast, rolling through the broken glass and coming up in a crouch in the dining room. The Kessler brothers moved as one. They didn't attack, they enclosed. Two bodies converging from opposite sides, flanking the crouching figure, blocking the path to the interior and the path to the kitchen in a pincer that reduced the intruder's options from many to two, forward into the counter or backward through the broken glass he'd just come through. The intruder chose forward, drove toward the counter, hit the overturned table that Bear had ordered positioned exactly for this purpose. The funnel, the choke point, the architectural trap that turned the intruder's momentum against him and channeled his body into the narrow gap between the table and the counter where Nora stood with her aluminum bat and 30 years of not letting people take things from her building. The bat connected with something. Bear heard the sound, hollow and resonant and final, and the intruder went down. A second figure came through the front. This one was bigger, slower, more cautious. He'd seen the first one fall and he entered with his hands up, palms forward, a posture that said, "I'm not the threat, I'm the negotiator, don't swing at me." And it almost worked, because the human brain was wired to respond to submission signals, to hesitate when a target stopped being aggressive. But Reno didn't hesitate. Not because he was violent, because he was experienced. Because he'd seen men enter rooms with their hands up and their weapons tucked and their intent hidden behind the performance of surrender. And he'd learned in places that didn't have names that the space between capitulation and deception was measured in microseconds. He caught the man's arm, twisted, and drove him face first into the nearest booth with a controlled impact that was precise enough to incapacitate and restrained enough to avoid permanent damage. The man hit the booth seat with a grunt, and Reno's knee found the small of his back, pinning him with the mechanical efficiency of a procedure performed so many times it had become reflex. "3 down," Reno called into the darkness. "2 in the kitchen," Griggs reported. "Contained." "That's 5, Bear said. "There's 6. Silence. The storm howled through both open doors, filling the diner with snow and freezing air that turned every breath into a visible cloud of vapor. The chemical fog from the extinguisher was dispersing, mixing with the cold, creating a haze that smelled like industrial powder in winter and adrenaline sweat. Griggs, the sixth. Can't see from here. Night optics are fogged from the extinguisher discharge. Bear moved to the front window. The black SUV that had pulled into the front parking lot was still there, engine running, headlights on, and standing beside it, not approaching the building, not entering, not engaging in the breach, was a figure, tall, still, hands in the pockets of a dark coat, standing in the headlights of his own vehicle with the composed patience of a man watching a play he'd already read the script to. Harlan Mace. He wasn't coming in. He was watching, counting, timing. And in his stillness, Bear recognized something that dropped his stomach to the floor. The specific, terrifying calm of a man who had planned for this outcome, who had sent 5 men into a building knowing they might fail, who had calculated the cost of 5 bodies and decided the price was acceptable because the purpose was never the breach itself. The purpose was the clock. Every minute Bear's people spent fighting the breach team was a minute they weren't watching the perimeter. Every body they contained was a body they had to guard. Every injury they sustained or inflicted was evidence that would complicate the narrative when law enforcement finally arrived. Harlan wasn't trying to take Maddie from the diner. He was trying to keep Bear inside it. Because somewhere, out there in the storm, on the county road, on the service road, on whatever secondary route connected the culvert exit to the highway, someone else was moving. Someone who knew about the tunnel. Someone who had studied this building's blueprints or history or drainage infrastructure, and who was right now positioning at the other end of the 60-yard passage through which Marion and Doc and Maddie were crawling toward what they believed was safety. Bear's blood turned to ice. He spun from the window, crossed the diner in the dark, hit the kitchen at a run, reached the open hatch behind the walk-in cooler and dropped to his knees and stared into the black void beneath the floor, where the tunnel swallowed the flashlight beams and the voices and the small, brave body of a child who had signed the word, scared with hands that were still marked by zip ties. And from somewhere deep in the tunnel, distant, muffled, carried through 60 yards of earth and concrete and the settling bones of a building built by a man in the 70s who had never imagined what his drainage tunnel would carry, came a sound. Marion's voice, screaming. Bear dropped into the hatch. No hesitation, no calculation, no tactical assessment of what waited below. Just gravity and the sound of Marion's scream pulling him downward through the opening like a hook set in the center of his chest, dragging him into the dark earth beneath Nora's diner with the same force that had pulled him through every doorway and every war zone he'd ever entered. Not courage, not training, but the biological inability to stand still while someone he'd sworn to protect was in pain. The root cellar was 4 feet high and smelled like decades of neglect, wet concrete, mildew, rust, the mineral tang of groundwater seeping through cracks in a foundation that had been settling since before Bear was born. His boots hit the floor and his knees buckled and his skull nearly cracked against a support beam in the dark. He caught himself with one hand on the cold wall and pulled the flashlight from his back pocket, the small tactical LED he'd carried since deployment. The one piece of military gear he'd never been able to leave behind because darkness was the one enemy that never stopped coming. The beam cut through the cellar and found the tunnel entrance, a rough-cut opening in the east wall, maybe 3.5 feet high, lined with crumbling concrete and old drainage pipe that disappeared into blackness. He could hear Marion's voice echoing through it, not screaming anymore, but talking, rapid and forceful, the cadence of a woman giving commands to someone who wasn't listening. Bear entered the tunnel on his hands and knees. The concrete scraped his palms. His shoulders brushed both walls. The air was thicker here, stale, cold, carrying the smell of standing water and something else beneath it, something organic and old that he didn't want to identify. His flashlight beam bounced off the curved walls and showed him 60 yards of narrowing passage that ran east beneath the frozen Wyoming earth toward a culvert exit he couldn't see. 20 yards in, he heard it. Not Marion's voice, a different sound. The specific, sharp, percussive impact of a body hitting a body. A grunt. The scuffle of boots on wet concrete. Then Marion's voice again, closer now, tight with fury and fear. "Don't you touch her! Don't you dare!" Bear moved faster, knees grinding against the floor, elbows cracking against pipe seams. The tunnel turned slightly, a gentle curve that followed the natural drainage gradient, and when he came around the bend, his flashlight found them. Doc was on the ground, face down, blood running from a gash above his left eye where his head had hit the tunnel wall. His medical duffel was scattered. Gauze, tape, syringes, all of it spilled across the wet concrete like the contents of a life emptied out. He was conscious. Bear could see his hands moving, trying to push himself up. But dazed, operating at half capacity, the combat medic's body trying to execute recovery protocols while his 61-year-old skull processed the concussion it had just received. Marion was standing, or rather crouching, because the tunnel wouldn't allow standing, between Maddie and a figure that Bear's flashlight caught in profile. Male, compact, wearing dark tactical clothing and a balaclava pulled down to his chin. He had one hand on Marion's shoulder, pushing her backward, and the other hand reaching past her toward the child pressed against the tunnel wall behind her. Maddie was silent, eyes open, body rigid, the absolute practiced stillness of a child who had been here before, not in this tunnel, not in this specific geography of terror, but in this exact emotional architecture. Adults fighting over her body, hands reaching. The small, desperate math of figuring out which direction to run when every direction contained a predator. Bear didn't announce himself. He covered the remaining distance in 3 seconds of violent forward motion. Knees, elbows, the animal locomotion of a man too large for the space he was moving through, driven by something that had stopped being tactical and had become purely, primitively, biologically parental. He hit the figure from behind with his full weight concentrated through his right shoulder, and the impact drove both of them into the tunnel wall with a sound like a car wreck compressed into a space the size of a coffin. The figure was fast, trained. He absorbed the impact and twisted, getting an elbow into Bear's throat. A precise, practiced strike that compressed his airway and sent stars exploding across his vision. Bear's hands found fabric, found body, found the geometry of another human being in the dark, and began the close quarters work that 16 years of suppression hadn't erased from his muscle memory. They fought in the tunnel the way animals fight in burrows. No room for technique, no space for form, just the brutal compression of two bodies in a concrete tube with 4 feet of vertical clearance and the sound of their own breathing echoing off the walls like something drowning. Bear took a knee to his ribs, felt something shift, not break, shift. The old fracture from the motorcycle accident in 2019 reminding him that his body was a patchwork of repairs and that every repair had a failure point. He got his hand on the man's face, found the balaclava, pulled it up and drove the heel of his palm into the exposed nose beneath it. The crack was wet and final. The man's head snapped back against the concrete and his body went slack. Not unconscious, but stunned. The temporary system shutdown of a brain that had just received more input than it could process. Bear didn't stop. He rolled the man onto his stomach, yanked both arms behind his back, and held them there with a grip that used the surgical pins in his knuckles as pressure points. The metal beneath his skin grinding against the man's wrist bones, with a pain that was both inflicted and received, his own damaged hands screaming at him while they did the work they'd been rebuilt to do. Doc, zip ties, in the duffel. Doc was up, barely, blood running down his face in a sheet that turned his beard black in the flashlight beam. But his hands, those medic's hands, those hands that had never stopped being useful even when the man they belonged to had been manipulated and deceived and broken down to his foundations, found the duffel, found the ties, and secured the man's wrists with the efficient speed of someone who had been restraining patients in field hospitals since before some of these tunnel walls had been poured. Bear released his grip, sat back against the tunnel wall, breathed. His ribs screamed. His throat burned where the elbow had landed. His knuckles were bleeding around the pins. The skin over the surgical sites had split open, and he could feel the warm wet of his own blood mixing with the cold wet of the tunnel floor beneath his hands. "Maddie," he said. The child hadn't moved. She was pressed against the wall 10 feet deeper in the tunnel, behind Marion, her body folded into the smallest possible configuration, knees to chest, arms wrapped around shins, face hidden between her kneecaps. The posture of a child who had made herself into a stone because stones didn't get taken. Marion reached her first, not with words, with presence. She lowered herself beside the child and placed one hand on the tunnel floor between them, palm up, an offering of contact without demand. And she waited. In the cold, in the dark, in a drainage tunnel beneath a Wyoming diner with blood on the walls and an unconscious man zip-tied on the floor, a 63-year-old woman in a denim jacket waited for a child to choose. Maddie's hand found Marion's, small fingers closing around weathered ones, the grip of someone arriving somewhere after a journey so long and so terrible that the arrival itself felt impossible. Bear turned to Doc. "Can you move?" "I can move." Doc wiped blood from his eye with his sleeve, blinked, focused. "Head wound. Looks worse than it is. I've had worse from bar stools." "Get them out. The culvert exit? Is it clear?" "I saw open ground before he hit me. No vehicles on the fence line. He came in alone." "Then go. Get them to the highway. Flag any vehicle heading south. Get Maddie away from here." "Bear—" "Go, Doc." Doc looked at him. In the flashlight beam, through the blood and the swelling and the devastation of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed around him in one night, Bear saw something he hadn't expected to see. Clarity. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just clarity. The specific, hard-won, agonizing clarity of a man who had finally stopped lying to himself about the cost of his own strategy and who understood, with the full weight of 61 years and 2 wars and 9 decoy rescues and 1 night in a tunnel, that the only thing left to do was the next right thing. Doc turned, moved deeper into the tunnel. Marion followed with Maddie tucked against her side, the child's face buried in the denim jacket, her small body shaking with a frequency that wasn't cold, but was the aftershock of terror metabolizing into something that might, eventually, with enough time and enough safety, become relief. Bear watched them go. The flashlight beams bounced and shrank as they moved toward the culvert exit, and then the tunnel swallowed them, and he was alone with an unconscious man and the sound of his own damaged breathing echoing off walls that smelled like 50 years of drainage and 1 night of blood. He crawled back. Through the tunnel, through the root cellar, up through the hatch, into the kitchen of Nora's diner where the cold poured through the broken back door and the chemical haze of the fire extinguisher still hung in the air and the sounds of contained chaos filtered in from the dining room. Reno met him in the kitchen doorway. "Maddie?" "Out. Doc and Marion have her. Tunnel exit. There was someone waiting. I put him down. They're heading for the highway." Reno's eyes dropped to Bear's hands. The blood. The split skin over the surgical pins. The way his right hand trembled with the specific vibration of damaged nerves and overstressed metal. "You're hurt." "I'm functional." "That's not what I asked." "That's the only answer that matters right now." The diner was a wreckage of overturned furniture, broken glass, chemical residue, and contained bodies. 3 of Harlan's breach team were zip-tied and seated against the far wall, guarded by Paulson and the Kessler brothers. 2 more were in the kitchen, secured by Griggs, one of them nursing the arm that Paulson's fire extinguisher had damaged. The truckers sat in their booths in various states of shock and adrenaline. Nora stood behind her counter with the baseball bat resting on her shoulder like a woman who had just defended her kingdom and was waiting to see if another wave was coming. Bear walked to the front window. Harlan Mace was gone. The black SUV that had been parked in the front lot with its headlights on and its engine running, gone. The space where it had been was a rectangle of snow disturbed by tire tracks that were already filling with fresh accumulation. He had left. Watched his team enter the building, watched them fail, watched the tunnel gambit get neutralized and calculated. With the cold efficiency of a man who measured outcomes in units of acceptable loss, that the operation was burned and the only remaining move was extraction. He had left his people behind. Bear felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief. Relief was too clean a word for what he felt. What loosened was the specific, suffocating tension of a man who had been carrying the weight of an outcome he couldn't control. And the loosening didn't feel like freedom. It felt like exhaustion. The bone-deep, cellular, gravity-doubling exhaustion of a body that had been running on adrenaline and trauma for 6 hours and was now receiving the bill. He sat down on the nearest stool, the one he'd originally chosen when he walked into Nora's diner a lifetime ago, back to the wall, eyes on the door. The stool was still standing. Everything around it had been overturned, broken, scattered, rearranged. But this one stool remained upright at the counter like a monument to the stubborn persistence of ordinary things. Nora poured him coffee, without asking, black, no sugar. The mug was different. His original had been broken in the breach, but the coffee tasted exactly the same, like asphalt in survival. "Mercer's on the radio," Nora said. "Plow got through. He's 20 minutes out." 20 minutes. The cavalry was finally coming, long after the cavalry had been needed, arriving to a scene that was already over, which was, Bear reflected, the most honest summary of his entire relationship with institutional systems. They showed up, they documented, they took statements and filed reports and processed evidence. But the actual work, the holding of doors, the crawling through tunnels, the standing between a child in the dark, that work had been done by people the system didn't trust, didn't credit, and would spend the next several weeks investigating. He knew what was coming. Interviews, depositions, the legal machinery grinding into motion with its gears and its procedures, and its fundamental structural inability to distinguish between the people who had broken laws to save a child and the people who had broken laws to steal one. Bear's record would be examined. His assault history in Thermopolis would be resurrected. His chapter affiliation would be scrutinized. Every scar on his knuckles and every patch on his vest would be entered into evidence not as proof of his character, but as ammunition for his prosecution. He drank his coffee anyway. Outside, the storm was dying, not dramatically, not with a final gust or a cinematic clearing of the sky. It simply diminished. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan to a murmur. The snow thinned from a wall to a curtain to a veil. And through the veil, the first gray suggestion of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, like something the world wasn't sure it wanted to show yet. Bear's phone buzzed, one bar, one text, from Doc. "Highway. Flagged a state patrol unit heading south. Maddie is safe." Claire Turner, her mother, was at the Laramie PD station. "Patrol's bringing her to us. 20 minutes. Maddie is asking for you." Bear read the text 3 times. Then he set the phone on the counter and pressed both hands flat against the laminate and closed his eyes and breathed. She was asking for him. A child he'd known for 6 hours. A child he'd found by accident in a diner he'd entered because his hand stopped working in the cold, was asking for him. Not because he was her father, not because he was her family, not because he had any legal, biological, institutional right to be part of her life, but because he had seen her. In a room full of people who looked past her smallness and her silence and her rehearsed invisibility, he had seen her, and she had seen him seeing her. And that mutual recognition, that raw, undecorated human act of one damaged person acknowledging another's existence, had created something that didn't have a name in any system or any court, but that was more real than any document either institution could produce. Reno sat down beside him. They didn't look at each other. They looked at the front window, where the dawn was slowly, grudgingly replacing the darkness with something gray and uncertain, but undeniably present. "You're bleeding," Reno said. "I know." "Let me see." Bear extended his right hand. Reno took it, not gently, not tenderly, but with the firm, practical grip of a man examining damage to determine function. He turned the hand over, looked at the split skin, the exposed surgical hardware, the blood drying in the creases of Bear's palm like a map of everything he'd done with these hands tonight. "You need stitches. Doc's not here." "I'll do it." "You can't stitch." "I stitched a saddlebag back together in Billings with fishing line and a leather needle. How different can skin be?" Bear almost laughed. The sound that came out wasn't quite laughter. It was something rougher and wetter, and closer to the noise a man makes when the weight he's been carrying shifts just enough to remind him that there was a time when things were lighter. Reno reached into his vest pocket and produced a flask. Not whiskey, hydrogen peroxide. He carried it the way other men carried bourbon, because Reno had been sober for 9 years and the only burns he tolerated anymore were the medicinal kind. He poured it over Bear's knuckles without warning, and Bear hissed through his teeth as the peroxide foamed white in the wounds, and the pain cut through the adrenaline fog with clarifying precision. 3 years, Bear said. Reno poured more peroxide. Yeah. I should have called. Yeah. I was wrong about Thermopolis, not about the kid, about how I handled it, about what I cost the chapter, about what I cost you. Reno capped the flask, set it on the counter, looked at Bear's hand, still holding it, still examining the damage, still maintaining the physical connection that was the only channel through which two men built from wreckage could transmit what they actually meant. You were a wrecking ball, Reno said. You saw a kid in danger and you turned into a weapon, and you didn't care what you destroyed on the way to the target. And that man, that version of you, scared me. Not because you were violent, because you were right. And a man who's right and violent is the hardest thing in the world to argue with, because every time you try to tell him he's wrong about the method, he shows you the result, and the result is a kid who's safe. How do you fight that? You don't. No, you don't. But you can't ride with it either, because the next time, the result might not be a safe kid. The next time, the result might be a dead biker in a parking lot and a chapter burned and 100 children who don't get helped because the network that was supposed to help them got shut down by a headline about a vigilante in a leather vest. Bear's throat tightened, because Reno was describing Doc. Reno was describing, without knowing it, exactly what had happened to Doc's intelligence network. The careful, patient infrastructure that had been corrupted and manipulated and turned into a sorting mechanism for which children got saved and which got swallowed. The same strategic patience that Reno was advocating had been used against them. And the brute force instinct that Reno was warning against, Bear's instinct, the wrecking ball, the man who saw a child and destroyed everything between himself and the rescue, was the only thing that had actually worked tonight. There was no resolution to that paradox. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I know about Doc, Reno said quietly. Bear looked at him. Torres talked while you were in the tunnel. Told us everything. The informant, the decoys, 3 years of manipulated intelligence. Reno's jaw worked. I'm going to deal with it. Not tonight, not in anger, but it gets dealt with. The chapter will know. Doc will answer for it. Not to me, not to you, to the Brotherhood, and then we figure out what's left. What's left of what? Of him, of us, of whatever Iron Passage is supposed to be after tonight. Bear didn't answer, because the answer was something he could feel but couldn't articulate. The sense that what Iron Passage was supposed to be had never been defined by its best operations or its worst failures, but by the space between them, the messy, imperfect, human space where damaged people tried to do right and sometimes succeeded and sometimes destroyed things, and sometimes crawled through drainage tunnels with bleeding hands to reach a child they'd never met, because not reaching her was simply, fundamentally, biologically impossible. Headlights appeared on the highway, not the threatening kind, the official kind. Red and blue strobing through the thinning snow, moving slow, accompanied by the distant, muffled wail of a siren that sounded tired and cold and very, very late. Sheriff Mercer arrived at 4:23 a.m. in a mud-caked patrol unit with 2 deputies behind him and a plow truck behind them. He was a big man in a brown uniform, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts found in a hardware store, all angles and rough surfaces, and a mustache that belonged in a different century. He walked into the diner, looked at the overturned furniture and the broken glass and the 5 zip-tied men against the wall, and the bikers standing among the wreckage like exhausted sentinels at the end of a very long watch, and he took off his hat and rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand. Somebody want to tell me what happened to Nora's diner? Nora answered from behind the counter. Justice happened to my diner, Ray, and you owe me a new front window. The next 2 hours were procedural, statements, photographs, the careful, meticulous, excruciatingly slow documentation of a crime scene by men with badges and clipboards who were good at their jobs, but who hadn't been present for the actual event, and who therefore had to reconstruct it from the accounts of people they weren't entirely sure they trusted. Bear sat in his stool and answered every question with the exhausted honesty of a man who had nothing left to hide and nothing left to protect except the truth. Decker and Torres were taken into custody. The 5 breach team members were loaded into a transport vehicle that Mercer had called from Cheyenne. The courier woman, the woman with the perfect smile and the dead calm eyes, was the last to leave, escorted by a female deputy who held her arm with the professional firmness of someone handling evidence rather than a person. As she passed Bear's stool, the woman stopped. The deputy pulled at her arm, but she held position for 2 seconds, long enough to look at Bear with an expression that contained no anger, no hatred, no defeat, but something worse: recognition. The mutual acknowledgement of two people on opposite sides of a line that ran through the center of a broken world, each understanding the other with a clarity that was more intimate than violence and more permanent than any verdict a court would eventually produce. Then she was gone. At 6:17 a.m., a state patrol cruiser pulled into the parking lot. Bear was outside. He'd been outside for 20 minutes, standing beneath the space where the neon sign used to buzz, fixing a deputy's frozen windshield wiper with hands that were wrapped in gauze and still bleeding through the bandages. His cigarette had gone out twice in the wind, and he'd relit it twice with the mechanical persistence of a man performing a ritual that had lost its meaning, but whose rhythm was necessary. The cruiser door opened. A woman emerged, small, dark-haired, wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather and shoes that were wrong for the snow, and the face of someone who had not slept in 11 days, and who had been crying so long that the tears had become structural, part of her features, part of her architecture, as permanent as bone. Claire Turner. She stood in the parking lot and looked at the diner and the buried trucks and the Harley tracks in the snow and the bikers moving among the wreckage like tired mechanics after a long shift. And her hands came up to her mouth and her shoulders began to shake, and no sound came out because the sound was too large for her body to produce. The cruiser's back door opened. Maddie. She stood in the snow in her purple coat, the same coat, too big, hanging off her shoulders, with Marion's blanket still wrapped around her and the one-eyed stuffed bear clutched against her chest. She looked at her mother across 20 feet of frozen parking lot, and she didn't move. Claire didn't move either. They stood there, mother and daughter, 11 days of absence between them, surrounded by strangers in leather and snow, and neither of them moved because the distance between them was not 20 feet of parking lot. It was 11 days of terror and helplessness and the specific devastating uncertainty of a mother who didn't know if her daughter was alive and a daughter who didn't know if her mother was real. Claire knelt, slowly. Her knees sank into the snow. She held her hands up, not reaching, not beckoning, just visible, open, showing her daughter that they were empty and that they would stay empty until Maddie decided to fill them. "I'm here," Claire signed. Her movements were shaky, imprecise, her fingers trembling so badly that the signs were barely legible. "You choose." Bear watched from the corner of the building. He'd fixed the windshield wiper. He'd finished his cigarette. He had no reason to be standing here except that his feet wouldn't move and his eyes wouldn't close, and something inside his chest, something that had been locked in a box since the day his own daughter stopped answering his calls, was opening whether he wanted it to or not. Maddie looked at her mother, looked at the snow, looked at the diner, looked at the sky, where the clouds were thinning and the first weak suggestion of sunlight was pressing through from behind like something trying to remind the world it still existed. Then she walked across the parking lot, not running, not desperate, walking, one step at a time, the deliberate, measured, sovereign pace of a child who had been moved and transported and carried and grabbed and restrained for 11 days, and who was now, for the first time, choosing her own direction. She reached Claire, stood in front of her, looked down at her mother's face, kneeling in the snow, tears freezing on her cheeks, hands open and waiting. Maddie put her arms around her mother's neck. Claire's hands closed around her daughter's body with the careful, trembling restraint of someone holding something she'd been told was lost forever, and that she was afraid to grip too tightly because the last time she held it, it was taken from her. Bear turned away, not because he didn't want to see, because it wasn't his. That moment, that reunion, that reclamation, that small body choosing its mother's arms after 11 days in the machinery of something monstrous, belonged to Claire and Maddie. It didn't belong to Bear or Iron Passage or the system or the story. It was private and sacred in the way that all acts of genuine reunion are sacred, and the most respectful thing a damaged man could do in its presence was look away and let it exist without audience. He walked around the building to the back, found his Harley still standing where he'd parked it a lifetime ago, buried under 6 inches of snow. He brushed the seat clean with his bandaged hand, checked the battery, turned the key. The engine caught on the 3rd try. Sputtering, reluctant, complaining about the cold with the mechanical indignation of a machine that had been abandoned in a blizzard and wasn't going to let its owner forget it. He sat on the bike, didn't ride, just sat, feeling the engine's vibration travel through the frame into his body, the familiar, constant, non-judgmental rhythm that had been the only consistent presence in his life for 15 years. More reliable than people, more honest than institutions. A machine that asked nothing except fuel and maintenance, and that gave back exactly what it received, no more, no less. Reno appeared beside him, leaned against a buried truck, lit a cigarette, his first in 9 years, and the look on his face as he inhaled said that he knew exactly what he was doing and had decided that tonight had earned it. Mercer's going to want a full debrief from the chapter, Reno said. I know. There'll be hearings. I know. Doc's going to need a lawyer. I know. You're going to need a doctor. Those hands look like ground beef. Bear looked at his hands. The bandages were soaked through. The pins ached with a deep, persistent, almost musical throb. E-flat, he'd always thought, the key of broken things. He flexed his fingers. They worked. Not well, not pretty, but they worked. Like the rest of him, functional wreckage, held together by stubbornness and the specific gravity of things that refused to stop. Reno. Yeah. I'm going to call my daughter. Reno smoked, didn't look at him. Looked at the dawn, which was arriving now with more conviction, pale gold edging the clouds, light spreading across the snowfield like water across a flat surface, slow and inevitable and indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it during the night. Good, Reno said. I don't know if she'll answer. Call anyway. What if she doesn't? Call anyway. Bear nodded, sat on his bike, watched the sun find the highway, the long, frozen ribbon of asphalt that stretched east and west across Wyoming like a scar across the state's face, connecting the places where people were broken to the places where people were mended, and sometimes those places were the same place. And sometimes the only thing between them was a diner with a dead neon sign and a woman with a baseball bat and a man on a motorcycle who happened to be in the right doorway at the right moment. A small figure appeared at the corner of the building. Maddie, still wrapped in the blanket, still holding the one-eyed bear. Claire behind her, one hand on her daughter's shoulder, the light touch of a mother learning to hold on without gripping. The girl walked toward Bear, stopped 3 feet from the bike, looked up at him with those brown eyes that had seen too much and learned too young that most adults were either dangerous or useless. She held something out, a crayon drawing, blue, done on a page torn from the coloring book Marion had brought. It showed, roughly, in the imprecise hand of an 8-year-old working with limited materials, a large figure in a black jacket standing in a doorway. Behind the figure, small and partially hidden, a smaller figure in purple. Above them both, a sky full of snow rendered in blue crayon pressed so hard into the paper that the wax had built up in ridges you could feel with your fingertips. Bear took the drawing, looked at it, looked at Maddie. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the only thing he had that was worth giving, a pair of winter gloves he'd bought in Rock Springs and hadn't worn because his own gloves were thinner and better for riding. They were too big for her, black, lined with fleece. He'd stitched a loose thread on the left one with purple thread from a repair kit because it was the only color he had. He held them out. Cold hands need backup, he signed. Maddie took the gloves, put them on. They swallowed her hands entirely, the fingers flopping empty beyond her own, and she held them up and looked at them with an expression that started at the corners of her mouth and traveled slowly, carefully, across her entire face like dawn traveling across the snowfield. Not sudden. Not dramatic, but inevitable. She smiled. The first real smile Bear had seen from her. Not rehearsed, not performed. Not the strategic deployment of a facial expression designed to satisfy an adult's expectations. A real smile, born from the small, ordinary, absurdly human act of receiving a gift from someone who had no reason to give one except that he wanted to. Bear folded the crayon drawing carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his cut, against his chest, where it would ride next to his skin for the next 3,000 miles of highway until the paper wore soft and the blue wax transferred onto the leather, and the image faded, but the weight of it never did. He signed one last word to Maddie, brave. Then he kicked the Harley into gear. Engines rumbled alive across the parking lot, one by one, the Iron Passage convoy waking from its frozen vigil. Paulson's truck, Griggs's battered pickup, the Kessler brothers' trailer rig, Vargas on a road glide that sounded like a thunderstorm compressed into 2 cylinders. Renault on his street bob, 9 years of sobriety broken by one cigarette that he flicked into the snow as he mounted up, the cherry dying in the white like a period at the end of a sentence. They pulled out of Nora's parking lot in formation. No rush, no roar. Just the steady, disciplined rumble of heavy machines carrying heavy men down a frozen highway that was slowly, grudgingly surrendering to the morning. Bear rode at the back. He didn't look in the mirror, didn't watch the diner shrink behind him, didn't search for Maddie's face in the parking lot or Claire's silhouette in the dawn, or the place where the neon sign used to buzz its half-dead message to the empty Wyoming highway. He rode east, into the sun, into the cold, into whatever came next. The hearings, the reports, the institutional reckoning, the phone call to a daughter he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, the long and uncertain road towards something that might be forgiveness or might just be the willingness to stop punishing himself for every door he hadn't walked through fast enough. The highway opened ahead of him, clear, salted, still glazed with ice in the shadows, but passable, leading toward Cheyenne, and then Denver, and then whatever town, whatever diner, whatever frozen parking lot the road eventually brought him to. He didn't know where he was going. He never did. That was the whole point of being a man on a motorcycle in the American winter. Not destination, but direction, not arrival, but motion. The act of moving through a landscape that was too large and too cold and too indifferent to care about one more scarred biker with bleeding hands and a crayon drawing against his chest. But the landscape didn't need to care, because in a diner behind him, a woman was pouring coffee into chipped mugs and sweeping broken glass from a floor that had held. And in a parking lot behind him, a mother was holding a daughter who had chosen to walk back to her. And somewhere on the roads ahead of him, 11 riders on heavy machines were carrying the weight of one night through the Wyoming dawn. Not because anyone had thanked them, or would thank them, or would ever know their names, but because they had been called, and they had answered, and that was enough. It was always enough. And years later, when Maddie Turner was old enough to tell the story herself, she would remember only one thing clearly. Not the tunnel, not the storm, not the zip ties, or the phone tone, or the woman with the perfect smile. She would remember a man in a leather jacket who sat down in a diner on the worst night of her life and looked at her, really looked at her, the way nobody had looked at her in 11 days, and signed 3 words beneath a table where nobody else could see. I see you. That was the whole story. That was everything.